Recording is on.
Oh, that was a decent echo, that was. Anyway, Eric, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. It's 9 a.m. my side and like 6 p.m. in Seattle time. I've only had about 4 hours of sleep, so if my questions are incoherent or a bit weird, just sort of rescue me from the pit of misery I am in.
I'll do my best. I don't think I've got more sleep than that any night this week. So,
okay, well, now you're one of the highest signals, the highest signal to noise ratios in the space, like of all time, in my opinion. I was chatting with, I think you also met a chap named Gareth out when you're out in Hong Kong. Do you remember Gareth? By chance? Nah, you probably met loads of people.
I can't place a face. I know the name.
Nah, it's all right. It's okay.
In Hong Kong, was that at Scaling?
No idea.
Okay. Yeah.
No idea.
I had a couple meetings there, group meetings with people.
Yeah. Yeah, you get around.
I'm awful with names too. It's like embarrassing. So.
Yeah. Dude, I think that echo is actually starting to come through a little bit. Yeah. Do you happen to have earphones, maybe?
Let me just turn down the volume a little bit. I got it all the way up.
Okay.
I can't plug my earbuds into the computer.
No.
I get on the phone.
Oh, I see. You got
better?
one of those. You got one of those Apple things.
Yeah. And
Okay, no problem.
I don't have my wired headset anymore. Is that better?
Testing. Yeah, it's all right. It's okay.
I can keep turning it down because I hear you fine.
Okay, great. Yeah. That's great. Then I'll speak a little. Well,
All right,
it doesn't matter. So, okay, higher signal in the space. You get around a bit, and the thing I want to sort of like intro in. I mean, we've got loads of information that we can cover. That I'd like to get into, but some of the stuff I find extraordinarily interesting. And one of them is you're a biker. Dude, you bike around the world.
This will be a much better conversation than any other subject. I think just talk about biking.
We can totally do that, eh? So I mean, okay, what kind of bike do you have?
Well, if you got your browser handy there for references.
I do.
I think it's cb750k5.org. So I did a rebuild on my old college bike, which had sat idle for 25 years.
Just wait, CB750K5. K5.
That's its model number.
All right.
Yes.
.org.
K5 is a 1975. It's a Honda CB750.
Dude, this is okay. So I'm getting server not found. So CB75K5.org.
CB750K5.
Oh, 750. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I got it. Oh.
That picture there is what it looked like the first time I fixed it up and then wrecked it up a little bit. But then the second picture is a couple years later. That's 1986.
Oh.
I don't have any finished pictures on the blog here, but it's. Let me see.
This is great. This is great.
I'll send you one. You can put it up or something.
No, I'm going through it now. I'm going. Oh, I should.
But there's actually no. Yeah. If you're going to show those pictures, it looks awful. So I gotta send the. I gotta. Are we on Telegram or something?
I don't think so, but we'll be on Telegram afterwards. We'll exchange numbers.
All right.
It'll be cool. We'll do it afterwards, and then during the editing, I can sort of overlay the photographs and make it look cooler than the rough metalwork that you've got on that website.
Oh yeah, I mean, the problem is that what happened was I got about halfway down. It was spending too much time blogging. I needed to spend more time working, so I just started tweeting out pictures. There's a whole ton of tweets. Every day I threw something new up.
Yeah. So what's up with the biking? I mean, you just like get on a bike and go from one city to another, but like you go across the Gobi Desert kind of thing.
Yeah, I rode in college. I had a friend who had a bike. He had a CB 404, and the first time I ever rode a bike was on the back of his bike up to my folks' place in Maine when I was just after my senior year of high school. Yeah. And I loved it. So they happened to have an old bike in their shop as it was a marina and was taken on trade for a boat or something. And so I got it. It was laying on its side. It was oil seeping out of the forks and everything. It was just, it was a wreck, but I got it running. And that first picture is kind of a couple of months after that. That was actually within a year after that. And then the second picture, I went down, I worked for IBM for a year in '86 during college. And I spent some time working on it. I repainted it. I tried to fix it up, and I did more damage than good probably in the engine. And that was that second picture. And then I went to the Navy, and I got out to California, and I met a friend when I was in flight school as a Marine that knew quite a bit about mechanics. And we tore down the engine and rebuilt the bike. And then it was beautiful, but it was more in the original style, very similar to the original style. So then it never quite got it finished. And so then during the Rona, I spent the whole summer and some of the previous year rebuilding it. And so it looks quite a bit different now, and put a lot of time, money, and effort into it. And I drove it from Seattle to Salt Lake and then to Malibu. And now it lives in my friend's garage in Malibu with my other bike, which is a Moto Guzzi.
So you store your bikes over there with your mate?
Yeah, I mean, if you know Seattle, it's beautiful in the summer. It's like Southern California, but that's only for like 2 months. The rest of the year.
Yeah, I was going to say it's sunny outside.
Oh yeah, it's. When I moved into an apartment a while back, a few months ago, and I just decided to look for the sunniest place I could find in town, and so that's it. That's a lake behind me. When the sun's not so bright, you can see the lake. And we just got lucky. Today is a lucky day. It's completely clear.
Dude, it looks great.
But most of the time, it's just cloudy, drizzly rain. It's like London here, so it's not a great place to ride.
Yeah.
So I keep it in Malibu, near Los Angeles, and that way you can ride to Mexico. You can ride out to Palm Desert, Palm Springs, Las Vegas.
But you also do global riding, don't you?
Yeah. So I hadn't ridden in about 20 years, and I did a trip with my old college roommate across Mongolia, mainly from north to south. From Ulaanbaatar down to the border, and that was great. I hadn't ridden in a long time, and it was quite an eye opener. Now I've ridden quite a bit more around the world, and I have to say that was probably the hardest place I could have picked that you could actually get somewhere. I mean, there's harder places, but you can't actually get anywhere. We did about
there's nowhere to get.
Well, I mean, like for example, crossing the Congo is something that's on my list, but probably do that last. It's just sometimes impossible to get anywhere. But Mongolia, you can get places, and people are helpful and everything, but it's really pretty difficult. There's no roads, there's no bridges. You're driving through rivers, and depends on, a lot of things go wrong. So we did all right though, and we made about 70 miles a day. And after we finished that, I started doing more trips. At the time, my son was planning all my travel, which was great, and he was amazing. He did that trip. So that was my 50th birthday. I was in the Gobi Desert, Mongolia, with a satellite phone. Called my son and thanked him for the trip on my birthday.
It was by yourself?
What? Sorry?
You were traveling by yourself?
No, that trip.
Or was it with your mate? Yeah, same one that your son organized.
The original plan came from my old high school friend who we were at a high school reunion before we were 40, and he said, "Hey, for our 40th, we should be in the middle of the Gobi." It was his idea, and but we ended up not doing it. He had another child, and timing just didn't work out. So 10 years later, my son asked me what I wanted for my birthday, and I said I want to be in the Gobi with a satellite phone and a motorcycle, and so he made it happen. And there's Ewan McGregor did this series called Long Way Around, which I hadn't seen. He did that in 2006. I did this trip in like 2007 16 or something. So I'd never seen that. And people told me about it. I saw it when I came back. And I was like, geez, if I had seen this before I went, I might have thought twice because, we had it at least as bad as he did. He never went south, so he didn't get a lot of the other stuff we got. But yeah, that was a good show. It really kind of shows you what it was like. But then we went from the least populated place to ride on the planet to probably the most. Next year we went to New Delhi, and rented some Indian-made Royal Enfields, and 4 of us this time, and rode around northern India for a couple of weeks, and it was really fun and interesting for the opposite reason. It's just always a throng of people, and Indian rules of the road are interesting.
Yeah.
But I've done, let me see, on bikes, I've done London to London, 10 countries in Europe through the channel. I've done northern Vietnam.
What do you mean by that? You start in London and end in
London? I
London?
rented a Triumph in London, took the Channel train, and did Antwerp, Amsterdam, Hamburg, Berlin, Prague, Munich, Zurich. Spent 4 days in Neuchâtel for an outdoor concert, which was great, in Switzerland.
I would have loved that.
And then came up over the mountains into southern France, and that was the best part of the ride, riding through southern French wine country. Yeah. And then into Paris, and then back through the Channel to London. Thunderstorms the whole way to the Channel and back from the Channel in the UK. Classic. But everything else was pretty nice. So I did Thailand with a similar group of people. 4 people. Did Northwest Thailand, the Mai Hong Song, near coming and going from I forget the name of the town now, city up in the Northwest.
Is that the one, the Golden Triangle place, where all the drugs used to flow through that area? I don't know. I would guess that would probably be on the waterfront by Bangkok. This is up in the mountains up in the Northwest. Chiang Mai is where we started, and we did a big loop, Mai Hong Kong loop, and another part. So it was like 2 weeks, and then I also did by myself. I rented, bought a bike in Saigon and rode to Hanoi up Route 1A. That's a nice one. That's a nice one.
Yeah, I did a meetup in Saigon, then rode up there, and that's when I decided to do, Hanoi cryptoecon. Well, that's when I decided to do the conference.
That was this year.
I picked Hanoi, which was last year.
Last year. That was last year in Hanoi.
Yeah, it was leap year, 2020, and before the conference we did we called it Bit Bikers, biker club, and I had a bunch of people signed up, but we lost so many people for the Rona. It was just myself and a friend from college he's the guy that stores my bikes in Malibu. So we all took a train up from Hanoi and then rode up along the Chinese border, all along the border and back to
that would be so good.
How long?
Dude,
don't
don't drop that concept, Bit Bikers. Don't drop it. It's excellent, man.
We did Colombia after the conference. I went down and we did. It was before the conference. I did 2 weeks in Colombia. I rented
What's
some
the
BMW.
internet like? Those guys have like rogue hackers that create their own internet
in Colombia.
Yeah.
I don't know. We were just riding and drinking and sleeping, we started in Bogota and ended up in Medellin, and we had 3 BMWs, which was the first time I'd ever ridden those. That was fun. And in Vietnam, I rode a Vietnamese-made bike, like a 125, which was actually a big bike for them.
Yeah.
And let me see, Thailand, we had Triumphs and Japanese bikes, in Mongolia, Japanese bikes, India was Royal Enfields. And I don't know, there's some other trips too, but.
These are all rented bikes?
Yeah, it's too much to ship a bike. It's not worth it. It's actually nice to try out some other bikes sometimes.
Yeah.
So,
I'd love to do that. Next time you're out in Asia or something, and you want to go on a biking session, you've got a biker mate, yeah.
All right.
I mean, it's not that I don't actually do biking. I mean, last time I rode a motorbike was like in 2000, and no, it was in Turkey. was in Turkey. But before that, I was living in Taiwan for like a year, and we went on holiday to Turkey, and we just rented a bike and just went around. That was fantastic. It was good fun. But mainly it was in Taiwan that I was riding around. But in Taiwan, it's just like, now that I would go back there and look at the traffic situation and say, holy shit, I just couldn't believe I was in that sort of traffic situation.
It's very civilized in Taiwan.
It is. But when you look at it from, when you just like, if you were to look at the traffic like as a newbie, it looks chaotic. There are definitely rules and stuff like that you can navigate through this. But at first, when you look at it, it looks very chaotic.
Everybody's got their own rules, Like India is especially interesting because people look at videos of people riding in India, whatever traffic, and they just think it's complete chaos. And once you jump into it, that's kind of what you think. And they have English rules of the road. It's all proper, They got people out there brush painting stripes on the sides of the road and the curbs and everything, just like in England. But stoplights and signs, everything looks very proper, but it's largely ignored. And it's like, the English left and we just still do what we do. But it took a couple of days to figure it out. But you figure out the rules, and they're just socially embraced. And in the U.S., people say, "Oh, that's that must be. How does that work? It's complete chaos. We don't do that." And I'm like, "Well, there's a good example of this that people don't think about, right? I don't know. You're in Australia, right? What's the rule on a four-way stop? Who goes first?
I'm in Hong Kong.
Oh, you're in Hong Kong. Sorry.
Yeah.
So
what's
I've never driven in Hong Kong. I don't know what the rule is there. When there's a four-way stop sign, right?
Yeah.
Who goes first when a bunch of people are at the stop sign?
Well, whoever arrived first.
Yeah, but
everybody stops.
That's not what the law says.
Is that not?
No, and this is what I mean, right? People who've taken their driver's test recently, whatever, you ask them, and they say, "Oh, the person on the right goes first." Okay. And when you drive right, I guess in Hong Kong you drive left, so it would be the person on the left, right?
Yeah.
But it's not what anybody does because it doesn't really make any sense. It would be rude to go, first if you were on the right, because who got there first, right? And so, or if there's blocking traffic, you both go, even if you were not first, right? Because it doesn't make any sense to make people wait. So this kind of how it works in a lot of places, but especially India, right? I wrote like 13 rules of the road that I learned while riding in India. One of them is, never stop at a stop sign. You'll get rear-ended because it's like stopping in the middle of a freeway for no reason, right? Like people have no idea why you stopped. like what's going on, And same thing with the stoplight in most cases. The few exceptions are, in a major city where there's a cop standing right there watching, and then and if it's like 4 lanes, intersection, that people will kind of stop, but it's generally, they have very, very well followed rules, but they're just not the rules that you read about.
Yeah. Right. But you also did Top Gun, didn't you?
I did. Yeah.
So you're like a real bona fide Top Gun dude.
Yeah.
As well as an instructor.
Top Gun's a long-standing institution. It started after Vietnam when our kill ratio got really bad. And they set up this school, and after that, it ran the same way for right up until my class was the first class that was. It wasn't the first class of the new program, but it was the first they had moved the base at the same time. So I was the first in Fallon, Nevada. It used to be in San Diego, and they changed it from a course where you just go get some training, you go back to your squadron as a kind of a more experienced junior officer, and you teach other people what you know, just as in your free time. And they changed it to more of a program to train instructors. What they used to do is they just pull instructors out of the class. They'd invite them to come be instructors. But they had changed the program within a couple classes of me going to what they call a Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program, SFTI. So it was a longer course because you were being trained not just in what they used to train, but also how to instruct, how to do presentations on the board and grade people and things like that. And so we became the standardization pilots for tactics across the fleet after that. And there were basically, there was an organization on the East Coast and one on the West Coast for the F-18s, and then Top Gun in Nevada. And so I went there. I think it was 10 weeks. Graduated and then went to the East Coast Strike Fighter Weapons School and taught for 2 years. And then I left the Navy. I got out and
start a business.
Alone and unafraid, as we would say as pilots. No retirement, nothing from the Navy, very little money, and I started a startup company in 90. I've been doing it in my bedroom for a year or so, but like 98, 99.
This is all software, right?
Yeah. Just I had a couple options. I had written some software the Navy was using. They probably still use for flight scheduling, and then I had some other software that was just configuration management stuff that I wrote. To actually work with another guy who did a lot of the early writing, and that was to just help automate the network that I had set up in our command in that training squadron, because it was early internet days. So I was running wires. I was running 2 NT 351 servers. I terminated all the wires, pulled them through the ceilings. I registered our .mil domain, Navy.mil domain. It was one of the. We had actual email addresses with our domain. It was cool. Nobody had that. And then I got involved in the CIPRNet, which is the secret internet protocol routing network the Navy has, and did some advising on training systems that were on that. And I also had my daily flying duties, training, and teaching duties.
So do you think the CIPRNet was the roots of your sort of cypherpunk? Your cypherpunk roots there?
No. Okay. So I got a computer science degree just because ever since like the early 80s, I liked writing code. And when I went to the Navy, I sold my Mac. I had one of the first, the original Mac 128 image writer thing. And I sold that and I decided this takes too much time. I need to focus on what I'm doing. So I got sucked back into it by the Navy when they found out I had a degree and everything. So I started doing stuff, side projects. And during that time, I went through some kind of political transformation while I was in the Navy. Probably started at around 91 as a consequence of the Tailhook Convention, which was a big scandal in 91 that I was there. And so at some point I ended up getting very interested in doing, maybe leaving and doing a business. And I started giving away software and then shareware. And somewhere along those lines, I started reading, I just read a couple books, and one of them was Decline and Fall of the American Programmer. Another one was Applied Cryptography, which is a classic, and it's where I kind of learned the essentials of cryptography. And then I got very interested in PGP and DigiCash, and internet telephony and stuff like that. But I was still full-time in the Navy. So I even contacted DigiCash, it's David Chum's company in Amsterdam, when they were just getting going, because I'd read their patents, and one of them had my name on it.
Right.
They hired a guy I have a Dutch name, so they'd hired a college kid with the name Eric Voskuil. Exact same name, right? Well, his first name ended in K.
So it wasn't you.
Yeah, it wasn't me. So, so I contacted them. They never answered me. And so anyway, I had this experience with DigiCash and PGP and everything. I had this old, it's probably still up there, this old PGP key, registered. But I just, it was just background knowledge. But I was aware of a lot of the stuff going on in the, crypto wars and privacy stuff. And I became a libertarian early in the 90s. I was a card-carrying party member in the U.S. for like 20 years. And later I dropped that and just decided I'm an anarchist. I had to, once I got done reading Rothbard, I was done with that. So
This is the second time that name has come up in these Indabas. I had an Indaba with Max Hillebrand, and he mentioned Rothbard too. I haven't. I got as far as Mises, but I didn't go to Rothbard.
I would start with Rothbard and then work back to Mises.
Really? Oh, okay.
Yeah, Mises is just he's anachronistic. He makes certain mistakes that Rothbard doesn't really make, and although I think Rothbard does carry forward a couple of his issues, but Rothbard, I think, was hired to make to update Mises's work to make it more current and readable. And he did an excellent job at that, but he actually ended up adding some of his own observations, which were good, especially around monopoly. And he just writes more clearly. He's more exact. It's not casual about it, but so that's why I would start there. It's easier to read. It's more comprehensive, and it's adds a little bit more and makes fewer errors. I would start maybe with Menger and then go to Rothbard. But it's reading, and I would only read Man, Economy, and the State. The other works by Rothbard are, in my opinion, kind of sloppy. Like I find a lot of people that have read, what has government done to our money? And I went and read it at some point to find out where, what was going on. I'm like, man, this is just superficial and misleading. And things he doesn't do in Man, Economy, and the State. It's a tough read because it's big, it's long, and I had to I read a few pages a day, and I just go through everything and just make sure I could prove to myself what are essentially theorems. And if I couldn't, I would just try to figure it out. And I always eventually come around and figure it out, but there were a couple things that didn't quite add up, and but the other thing I think about when I think about economics and the way it's written in what we call the Austrian school, I don't really care about any others, it's just nonsense. But it's still too informal for my taste, and we use these terms praxeology, catalactics, Austrian economics, and they don't really have clear definitions, so they're really not applied clearly. So I tend to use the term rational economics. Like in reading Rothbard in the beginning and then Mises as well, and then Menger, you get the feeling, but it's not clearly stated. Rothbard does a pretty decent job, that this is an axiomatic system, right? We have a small set of assumptions, axioms, and then we derive everything from that. It's not observational or empirical in any way. But the way they talk about it, it took me a while to kind of clearly come to this conclusion, because the way they talk about it, it's kind of fuzzy. And Rothbard talks about, and Mises talks about history, history-based economics. Really what they're talking about is empiricism, right?
Yeah.
Observing what's happened and deriving theories from that. But Brother's very explicit. Theories are theories. They're not proven, and they're not the basis of a scientific theory is repeatability, and things are repeatable because the systems are fairly predictable. But we're talking about human beings and preferences, and these are not as predictable. They're not scientifically predictable. And that's the basis of this system of economics. So I would, at some point, if I have a lot of spare time, I might just write up rational economics. Like let's actually put this on a strong footing, like a logician would do, not a social scientist. Because that's really what it is. And I find that people if they don't read closely enough, they're not seeing that. You'll see in the beginning of these works, Human Action and Man, Economy, and State, they talk about what I call axioms, and I don't know if they ever actually use those terms, but we have the action axiom and the axiom of time preference, and people have heard those, but they talk about these ideas as if they're universal or obvious truths, right? Well, there is no such thing. These are assumptions. And if you accept the assumptions, then you accept the conclusions using pure reason that you can derive from these assumptions. And that's geometry. It's an axiomatic system. That's true of mathematics. We didn't used to think it was true, but mathematics, is based on assumptions. And ever since Russell's paradox showed that there was a problem. And the same is true of probability theory. And so we have economic theory, an axiomatic system, probability theory, mathematics. You put these together and you have all the stuff that makes Bitcoin. I add one more axiom, just we assume this can work in defense against the state. We can't prove it. So if we want to believe that it has these properties, we have to make certain assumptions. So I find that very interesting. And we have the intersection of these different axiomatic systems that are all based on certain assumptions. Then if you're willing to accept those assumptions as something to work from, you can derive the rest.
Okay. Since COVID has hit, has your opinion changed at all on the efficacy of the state?
No.
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 Okay. No. I mean, it can be. There's a time for an update, and since this COVID situation has hit, it becomes very, very transparent, like to what degrees the state is prepared to go to do certain things. Yeah. And if not, it's probably confirmed your hypotheses thus far.
Hey, let me shut my door. Keep hearing traffic noise outside.
All right.
A little better.
Yeah. Now I know I know you've got I think it's a 4-stage model of the state. Okay, before we do that, do you want to explain to us the security, the threat model,
of Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Well, so there's Bitcoin as a system, and then there's individual people with their money. And there's different aspects of security. How do you keep your keys from getting lost? How do you prevent yourself from generating a key with a weak seed or something, right? How do you prevent double spends, or how do you guard against yourself being double spent, right? These are all individual levels of security, but Bitcoin itself exists as a system that can defend against the state. That's why it's necessary. If the state wouldn't pull a Liberty Reserve, then any company just put together a decent money and it would be fine. An individual, right? So the state has an interest in people using its money, because state money is a tax system, specifically because it's not produced in a competitive market. And in other words, they have a monopoly control over production of the money. Therefore, they get a monopoly price if they can get people to use it. Whereas all other non-state monies are produced at market price. So there's no signage, which means there's no inflation in the production. Gold production is not inflationary in terms of price. Neither is Bitcoin. But and there's no tax taken out of it, and it's produced at market price. So nothing produced at market price is inherently inflationary. Prices of things stay the same despite people making more of them, right? You stay, there's always fluctuations, but as an economic principle, that's it, and that's one of the things that I find Mises and Rothbard and others, they tend to mistake. And this was one of the major critiques I had of human action was Mises does this giant hand wave over his explanation of, what's essentially Cantillon effect, And it's just an error. It's a clear error. But each time he's making one of these errors, he's doing it in the same context. It's in denigrating state money. Apparently if you don't figure out what's the problem with state money, then you do that for the wrong reasons. And I would say, like I mentioned I think in the intro of my book, like he sacrifices his objectivity to his passion, and makes these errors. So state money is a tax system. Bitcoin needs to exist. It has to be able to prevent control by the state. And Satoshi was clearly aware of that. And the security model that presents itself from the code or from the white paper, the principles that are laid out, isn't always quite so obvious. And I spent some time just trying to think through, what is it that distinguishes Bitcoin from everything else? And, so therefore, what are the defining characteristics and what is the actual security model for the threat against Bitcoin itself? So one aspect of it, I spent probably a year just thinking about on and off. And then all of a sudden it just came to me. I was walking on the street one day and it just came to me. Sorry, I'm getting these crazy notifications that I need to shut off so I don't have making all this noise. A second. Okay, hopefully that will stop those.
It just came to you. So, some revelation just came to you.
It was one aspect. Okay, so we have a 51% attacker, right? State steps in, says, well, the phases you mentioned, they present themselves from the security model. There's different aspects of the security model which anticipate different phases of the threat. My memory's horrible. And you can forget my own writing.
And you can flip between the different states.
Sure. I mean, you have a stage where it's, okay, so Bitcoin is saving people from paying tax. So there's an impact on tax if it's significant. But initially, there's no impact at all, so nobody cares, right? The threat is dormant. Nobody cares. They call that the honeymoon phase. Of course, that's where it has to start. And then you get to the point where it starts having an impact. There's this money laundering going on, which means the state can't see what you're doing, right? There's two aspects to tax. One is signage, the ability to create the money monopoly protection, make it at lower than cost. And at a cost lower than its face value, essentially. And the other one is transparency. If you can see what everybody's doing financially, it's much easier to tax what they're doing. So the state wants both of those things from its money. That's why it has it. And if there's no impact, it doesn't care. But then there starts being an impact, or they start recognizing the potential impact. So you start seeing laws being applied, and that's already been, that's already gotten pretty far. Some places like Nigeria, it's just completely outlawed. Other places in the U.S., there's a lot of stuff that's outlawed, like not paying your tax on your capital gains when the dollar drops. Right?
I think they've dropped the Nigerian ban. They banned it and then dropped it again.
I can't keep up, but and I don't watch news, not even much in the Bitcoin space. So, but there's different aspects. Like in Vietnam, it's not legal to use it as currency, but you can own some, speculate on it, whatever. Right? There's all these different aspects. In the U.S., it's not legal to you can't go on a exchange and trade with them without providing identity and that being reported. Coinbase reported all my transactions. They sent me a letter telling me that, I was part of that lawsuit. And so they sent all, which I expected. I had an account there for a while. And, I wasn't naive about it. So, that's the next phase where you get into this black market phase, where if you want to do the things that give you the benefit from Bitcoin, you have to be willing to not obey, right? If you don't, for example, signage. Well, people say, well, the government can't print it, but they can tax you, take away the same value, right? And so when say the dollar drops in half, you have a capital gain in Bitcoin of, what's that, 100%? So now you're paying tax on the dollar dropping. Okay, so if you pay it, you're not getting certainly the full benefit. You're getting some. So you don't get the benefit from the technology. You get the benefit from not obeying, right? And Bitcoin makes that easier to do. With the dollar, if you hold it, you're paying, right? If you just pay the inflation tax. With Bitcoin, they have to come get it from you, so it's different. Anyway, so there's this what I call the black market phase. This phase of laws being applied to it, which is trivially easy to do. Bitcoin has no defense against that. I've written all the code; it's not in there, and so that may or may not be very effective. It may actually, increase or decrease use of Bitcoin, who knows? But it may not be sufficient for the state to get what it wants, which is, control over the money. And then, the obvious next step is to step in and start mining. So you see these aspects in the security model, the black market phase. What we're talking about in the security model is the ability to hide. People use this term decentralization, they use the term privacy, but these are techniques. The techniques exist to allow people to hide, right? Decentralization alone does not provide security. I use the example of companies. Companies around the world are highly decentralized, but they're also taxed and they pay their tax. Otherwise, they're black market. So decentralization alone does not prevent you from being controlled. You have to, the benefit of decentralization is you've got to go control a bunch of people and they can hide, right? But you can control a bunch of people if they're not hiding. So decentralization is a hiding technology, right? It allows people to spread out the risk, take a little bit themselves and hide. Unlike, say, Liberty Reserve, which it was easy, they were very visible. Just went down there and take them. So privacy in terms of transactions, is another technique to allow people to hide what they're doing. And the aspect of mining being, only requiring essentially energy and internet makes it easier to move it to places where people can hide. So that's a central aspect, the risk sharing principle, right? People can share risk, and that helps you in this black market phase. But then you get into the observation that the state just step in and set up a big mine, and they don't need to do it everywhere. Actually, it's more effective and more profitable to do it one place on the earth. It doesn't matter how many of them do it. All that matters is how much economic power they have, how much tax revenue can they generate. So and it doesn't, mining as a big miner is not something you do at a loss. Bigger miners are more profitable. And they're disproportionately more profitable. So there's an advantage to being that big, visible, miner that can censor them. So they get to 51% and they start censoring, and now no transaction gets through unless it's approved, which is the way the existing financial system works around the world. So that's a nice thing. And so the question that came to my mind was, well, so the second principle of Bitcoin is that it uses energy syncing as its authority for who gets to order the transactions. So you have two basic models that any system would have to conform to. Either the authority is based on something that's on the chain, or it's not. There's only two possibilities, right? So if it's on the chain is proving itself. Then we call that stake. And if it's not on the chain, it's work. And work is always going to boil down to energy and the stuff that gets produced with energy. But the interesting thing is that if you sink energy into the system, which is what Bitcoin does, more can always be added. With stake, once you have a controlling stake, whatever that is, nobody can remove you. You control history. This
is why proof of stake coins are shit coins.
Yes, because they pretend to have the security model of Bitcoin, but they do not. Because so the question is, so that's the second principle, right? That Bitcoin is energy sinking. That's what allows people to add more energy, more power to overcome the censor. and a staking system, the sensor cannot be removed if it doesn't want to be. So it perpetually controls the coin. And but the third principle is, okay, well, who pays for that? Who pays for that? That was the question on my mind. Nobody had proposed to really an economically rational solution for that. We'll all donate. Well, that's economically irrational. Everybody's going to have to operate at a loss so they can save money. It doesn't make any sense. So Satoshi never suggested a solution to that. He kind of said, community get bands together and we all donate and we force out the sensor. So at one point it occurred to me that, well, this is just a natural behavior of Bitcoin. He designed it, or she designed it, and didn't know, right? When a transaction is not being confirmed, you increase your fee. That's a natural behavior. And when a transaction is not being confirmed because it's censored, whether you know that or not, you raise your fee. And as those fees are rising, the censor is not able to collect them because they're not confirming the transactions. So that provides increasing excess profit to anybody who does want to take them. So now we're paying for that additional hash power with fees. If Bitcoin was an inflation-only coin, it wouldn't be censorship resistant because the censor would earn the same amount as every other miner. And there'd be no way to incent those other miners, at least not. You'd end up with a side fee market, which is fine. I actually mentioned that in my book. There's nothing wrong with side fees, except they're not private, right? The putting fees in the transaction makes them as anonymous as the transaction. So you either develop a side fee market to push out the censor in an inflation-only coin, or it doesn't work. So fees rising incents more hash power and potentially overcomes the censor. At that point, the censor has to decide whether to operate at a loss. Up until that point, the censor is perfectly profitable. They're making money and they're censoring the chain. But at the point where fees rise and now they're at 9.9%, and they're fundamentally losing this conflict, they have to decide whether to subsidize their operations with tax revenue. And that subsidy, the state is the only entity that can perpetually operate at a loss in the money because it's first of all, it has the power to compel tax. It always operates at a loss, but more specifically, it has its own revenue stream that it's protecting. It's protecting tax revenue with the dollar, the euro, rand, whatever, against Bitcoin. So it's not a net loss, and that's economically irrational for anybody else to do, to perpetually operate at a loss to suppress the chain, so to suppress transactions. So this is a question: how does it defend against this entity that's essentially being profitable by operating at a loss in Bitcoin? And that's due to what I call the fee premium. It's not the total amount of fees. It's much smaller than that, right? Or presumably much smaller than that. It's the difference between the prevailing fee rate in the censored market and the prevailing fee rate in the black market, right? Because that difference is the loss that the state is taking by not accepting those transactions. If they have a competitive group of miners that are, and they're having to increase their hash rate in order to overcome that without being paid for it. So that's what I call power balancing, the third principle, which is Bitcoin is power balancing. It's fee based, and you need these three principles, and you don't have Bitcoin. And those are the essential principles that are laid out in the code and the paper. That you share the risk both for accepting Bitcoin and for mining, which is a form of accepting. You spread it around, and you sink energy in the system, which allows you to push out the censor. And you have a fee-based system of confirmation, which allows the people who are able to push out the censor to be paid for it by the people who want their transaction confirmed, which is economically rational. That does, however, imply that that premium is an extra cost that people are having to pay to use this money. And if they don't want to pay it, they won't have it. And that's the question. Would that be sufficient? Well, who knows? Who knows how much the state or the taxpayer is willing to pay to continue to suppress this money versus how much the market, individuals are willing to pay to get their unauthorized transactions confirmed. So that's not a knowable thing, right? This is one of the things we're not just, you have to assume it. If we assume Bitcoin's going to work or can work, then that's the assumption you're making. I call it the axiom of resistance. Right? It is possible to resist the state, and this is how it works. But all we know is it's possible. We can't prove that it will happen or that it won't.
I see. Right. So further to this body of work that you created with these three basic principles, you've also created a book which actually illustrates all the different sorts of fallacies and misunderstandings associated with Bitcoin in many different regards, and one of them is the energy usage. Now, I personally, I'm okay with this. I think I have a firm enough grasp of the understanding of why it's actually a good thing. But I'm kind of keen to hear your opinion on this, because I'm getting educated people who are loosely throwing around the sayings along the lines of Bitcoin is boiling the oceans. And I think there's an element of ideology that's going on there, because any sort of like a sort of rational rebuttal that I give them is completely disregarded. So I'm quite keen to hear your take on this.
Well, I'll avoid a deeper conversation about who owns the oceans and property rights, et cetera, and who cares, right? But just getting into maybe another approach to these questions, the question of what's more energy consuming, the global state money system or the Bitcoin money system. There's a theory that I have, essentially that all production resolves to energy. Right? Nothing moves. Nothing can be done without energy. Nothing happens. Right? Energy makes things move. So all things that are produced, done, secured, et cetera, all boil down to energy costs. Human labor, food for them, et cetera. Right? All these things are energy based. The common denominator of all production. So if you look at the energy cost of securing Bitcoin, you can say, well, okay, the whole system. This is what it consumes in energy, and therefore that's its price, right? You can look at that pretty clearly. They're very tightly correlated. So the same must be true of dollars, euros, whatever. So if you're a person who has a choice to use Bitcoin in one situation or use a dollar, the question is, well, when you do that individually, you're making that choice. Right? You're the one who's burning the energy, right? You're causing the production to happen. It's not the miners, right? They don't get paid, they're not going to do it. So by creating demand, by your demand, whether that's paying fees or just demanding the money so you can use it for something, you're creating that energy consumption. Same thing with the dollar, right? If nobody used the dollar, it wouldn't consume energy. There would be none produced. It wouldn't be trucked around. It wouldn't be accounted for with all these computers. There would be no security guards, blah, 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 right? So the one you choose to use is the one that's more useful to you, right? By definition. So that means it's cheaper for you and it's more efficient for you. In other words, this is probably explained more clearly in the book, but the one people are using is the cheaper one, and the cheaper one is the one that's using less energy. This very hard. People have tried, right? How do you sum up the entire energy consumption of the dollar or the euro or the global fiat monetary system, or state monetary system? I don't say fiat because Bitcoin's a fiat. Believe it or not. So fiat is not the distinction. It's the fact that it's monopoly money, which I often just call state money. So you have monopoly money, which consumes a certain amount. But if people prefer to use another money, it means it's less costly for them. So it's cheaper. So it's using less energy. It's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is, who cares? right? What energy gets used on. If Bitcoin, if Bitcoin grew to a certain level where it was causing energy prices to just rise astronomically, what would happen? It would use less energy, right? Because the price is rising. When the price of the energy rises, Bitcoin uses less energy. So it can't, like people say, well, it'll use all the energy in the world. Like, that's absurd, right? Because as all the energy in the world is getting used, you have this, exponentially increasing price curve for energy, and Bitcoin is therefore exponentially using less of it. So it's just kind of silly. And who's to say what's a better use of, energy for things? Right? These are all everything that people buy, consume, whatever, produce is all based on human preferences. And if people prefer to spend their energy money on Bitcoin, then why not?
I knew I would be coming into this this discussion with perspective changing. I was prepared to have my perspective changed in a number of things because you're so far ahead of the game of anybody else in the space. It's just people are going to cotton on to this like years later and like, oh yeah, Eric was right.
Yeah, I'm just nuts, but I've just gotten very used to being misunderstood, and I just okay, I understand it. It's good for me.
No.
This whole series of fallacies and whatever I read, I didn't try to write a book. I just got sick of saying the same things over and over again, 148 characters at a time or whatever it is. And I just started putting them in our wiki on the libbitcoin repo and then linking to them because I was familiar with editing the wiki because I was writing documentation. So, the fallacies just piled up because there's so many things that people believe that just seem like nonsense to me. And then but there's other things, right, that I figured out or that were maybe obvious to everybody, but I wrote down in a clear way so we could point them to people. So the book isn't like comprehensive. It's not a front to back explanation of Bitcoin. It's just a bunch of random topics that I strung together, put them in alphabetical order, organized them by major category, and stuck in a book. Because people kept asking me, and there were a bunch of people that actually made PDF books out of it, and I was like, I should just do this, have a conference, it'll be fun, go to Vietnam, ride some motorcycles, and so we produced the book for cryptoecon and gave them out to everybody, and that was it. I think I printed 200 copies, and they're still sitting in a motorcycle shop in Vietnam, the ones that didn't get handed out. I've only got one myself. It's the back of the room there. Where is it? There's the sole remaining copy on the. On the little block there of cryptoeconomics, the first version. And so, when I got done with the motorcycle project and I came home, I decided to get it out on Amazon. So I spent some time on that. But this was not, it's not an attempt to be comprehensive or anything. It's just a bunch of random ideas.
It's still a valuable contribution to the space. Now, what are the typical ones that are the ones that get asserted a lot? They're brought up a lot. Maybe we can go into like a top 3 or something like that.
Well, it changes over time. Like I've had I've had an inkling to write a few things in the last few weeks. I haven't, and I don't even ask me to try to remember what they are because they come and they go. And if they keep coming up over and over again, I used to just write them down, get them off my chest, and to remember them and let other people critique them. Yeah. And I've got a lot of good critiques. I made a number of changes, and the entire history of the book up until the first publication is in the wiki. Every single change I ever made. There's some significant changes. I sometimes I just recognize things, errors myself, or other people convince me, and other times they don't. But anyway, the more significant ones, the ones that during some time period were very common, and I find it interesting that like some of the prevailing theories on how some things worked have just kind of died out. Others seem to have long legs, but so for a time, proof of work hard fork was the explanation for how we defended against the state 51% attack, and didn't make any sense to me. And I wrote this topic up. The proof of work fallacy is probably a misnomer, but I explained the several things that go wrong when you do that. And then I think there was several shitcoins that went through this, and exactly what happened to them. from my recollection. Every time you fork yourself off, you reduce the size of the economy, and you don't get rid of the miners you're trying to get rid of. You get rid of the ones you're trying to keep, the smaller ones. The bigger ones are more profitable, and so they retool and come back. They're anonymous anyway, so how do you know who you're getting rid of, right? And I asked one of the world's biggest miners this way back, not too long after I wrote that topic. We were on a panel together, and I leaned over and I said, "Hey, if there was a proof of work, hard fork, what would you do?" We just retool and keep mining. Because they got capital, they got access to capital, they have saved capital, and they have experience, they have infrastructure, they have a business, right? Somebody mining in his basement, he's like, screw it, I'm done. I'm already losing money, right? So there's a whole bunch of reasons why it didn't really make sense. And then we get into this, who's in control of this process, right? And essentially what the process becomes is some authority telling you what's now the new chain. How else do you know, right? Everybody has to somehow know. So you've undone the key innovation of Bitcoin, which is nobody does that, all right? Satoshi laid down the first block, and he was the authority for that. After that, nobody gets to tell you. So then you get into problems of how do you coordinate these changes without miners the threat front running you. You're telling everybody. You're not telling them. They're anonymous. So that was a really common one, and I find it interesting. You just don't hear it very much anymore. Some people that are maybe new and they've watched some old blog, some old videos on Bitcoin and stuff. They'll say those things, but I don't hear it nearly as much as I used to. And I think one of the reasons for that was there was no other explanation. Nobody had another way it worked, and I gave people another explanation to me, and maybe that was working. I don't want to give myself too much credit, but
maybe it's sunk in.
I'm happy. Yeah. Like I came up with a better explanation than we're just gonna, somebody's gonna tell us there's a new fork that we need to follow, and hope that the miners don't know about it. Hope that enough people come along that the money doesn't, keep tanking every time we do it.
Yeah. I mean, a number of shitcoin creators. I think during 2017, a lot of us got really irritated and pissed off with shitcoin shillers and the creators of these shitcoins. That's I think this time round, the lesson might have sunk in because it's translated into quite a lot of money lost, right? So I think also that's one of the reasons why the Bitcoin community at the moment seem on edge now, because they know that a lot of new people coming into the space, they're going to be exposed to these shitcoiners that are pushing security models, supposed security models on the same level as Bitcoin, whereas it's definitely not.
People, let the buyer beware. People lose money, then they learn lessons, and people get smarter over time. It takes care of itself.
Yeah.
It's not, people that get all I don't have any problem with altcoins. I don't even have any problem with shitcoins. I just, they need a name, and there was already a name. So, but they needed a clear definition. There wasn't a clear, some people say shitcoin's anything but BTC. And some people say shitcoin is anything, that's pre-mined or scam, whatever. What is the scam? What is the thing that makes it shitty, right? I mean, Litecoin could have been Bitcoin. Satoshi could have fired off the first version, and it could have been Litecoin, and that wouldn't be a shitcoin anymore, right? It's the principles of Bitcoin that he laid out in the paper are what I mean when I refer to Bitcoin. These are the principles. And then I spent some time to deduce what I thought were the fundamental principles of it, which are called cryptodynamic principles, the forces that secure the money against, inflation and secure transfer of the units, I guess, and production of the units. And those principles apply to a lot of coins. They don't apply to any proof of stake coins. They don't apply to coins that don't have integrated fees. You could say, well, maybe if they had a side fee market, but that's not in the coins. The coin itself is shitty.
Bitcoin initially didn't have any fees.
Right, and it wasn't secure. Right, it could have easily been overpowered, but it had a model to move from the honeymoon phase where it didn't need it into a phase where hopefully it'll get to at some point where, and it's not. Remember, it's not the level of the fees. That's double spend protection. The level, the cost of reversing a transaction has to be higher than the benefit. So. You either wait, you pay that cost in time, you wait for 1, 6, 100 confirmations, or you don't spend, an amount that's well worth reversing. If you get onto some weaker coins, then you would probably not want to secure as much because it would be too, worthwhile to reverse the transaction. So, Bitcoin has been obviously much less secure against double spends than it is now, but it wasn't a shitcoin back then, right? So there are some coins that are much less secure against double spends than Bitcoin, but they're much more useful for smaller transactions. Bitcoin is useless for, anything under $100. I mean, who's going to pay, I don't know what it is now, $20? So like 20% of your, so, you get paid in Bitcoin and then you spend it. So now 2 transaction fees at $20 each. You spent $40 out of your 100, right? Sorry for normalizing everything to dollars, but this is what we have to do. It's just not useful. It's a really shitty coin for small transactions. Now you can talk about Lightning, et cetera, but you still have to settle in order to secure yourself. And you need to open and closing transactions. You're still paying fees, and those in a way limit your utility. Plus, you have other weaknesses when you have other security issues you got to deal with layering systems. What
systems?
I'm sorry?
With the what systems?
With layering systems.
Layering systems, okay.
Yeah. So they're fine, but they're trade-offs, right? And so are other coins. They're trade-offs, right? Weaker double spend security. So you don't spend as much on them. But anyway, what defines a shitcoin? I just, if what I decided to use for the very short chapter on what's a shitcoin was, so first I wrote cryptodynamic principles, which are the 3 principles I laid out, that Satoshi laid out in his paper, and I clarified and explained. And if a coin, if something, I don't know if you can call it a coin, but if something, conforms to those principles, then it's a Bitcoin. It may be a shitty Bitcoin, right? It may have used some weak crypto or something, but it adheres to the principles. Whether it's got a big, user, or merchant base or, high hash rate or market price, whatever, those are all interesting things when it comes to how useful it is, but it still follows the principles. If you have something that doesn't follow those principles, but pretends to, tells people that it does, like a lot of proof of stake coins, they claim to have, significant, better, whatever security than Bitcoin, then they're not talking about the threat, which is the state, right? The state gets to, obtains privately, with nobody knowing, right, control of the coin and start censoring. What can you do? There's nothing you can do. And so those claims are invalid, and it's more about the way it's presented. If you want to do some centralized money system, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Just don't tell everybody it's a Bitcoin. Otherwise, you'll end up getting called a shitcoin, right? But there's lots of more centralized financial systems that are perfectly legitimate. They're not frauds. And that's true, of a lot of other coins, as long as they don't tell people that this is more secure than Bitcoin, right?
Yeah. So I suppose an example of that would be CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, which go exactly to what you wish, what you suggested earlier on, which is like unmitigated, unseen levels of transparency. As well as control of the money.
Right. If something like that, presumably the reason they want to do that is so they can give the appearance of having the characteristics of Bitcoin, and also neutering, gutting the value proposition of Bitcoin because it doesn't adhere to that security model. So that's clearly a shitcoin, right? Any state crypto is a shitcoin because it's not, the very fact that it exists implies that it doesn't adhere to those principles. And as a result, if it implies that it does, then it's a shitcoin. Let's put it in that category. But take another coin that's, take for example, just take the code from BTC and change a couple bits in the Genesis block and start over. It's still Bitcoin, right? It's just got a different history. It's on a different, fork or root. It still follows all the same principles. It might have a small market, but so did Bitcoin. And it's very unlikely that something very similar to Bitcoin, something very similar to BTC, right, is going to create a larger market until there's financial pressure to do so. Why wouldn't you just use Bitcoin, right? Network effect is a real thing. Money is a network effect, and the more people that accept it, the more useful it is. But Bitcoin also has fees, which are necessary, and the more expensive it gets to use, the less useful it is. Right? There's a downward pressure on its demand when its demand rises, which is what makes it stable. And at that point, you start to see altcoins popping up that may have very similar characteristics to Bitcoin. They're just smaller because the whole point is they're going to handle smaller transactions, right? Because they're no longer viable on Bitcoin. So I see there's a perfectly reasonable market solution to the question of scalability. It deals with things like sharding, right? You don't have to carry all the data. You just atomic swap over to BTC 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? With declining levels of acceptance, or maybe increasing levels, but for smaller amounts, right? And that's a perfectly reasonable solution. There's nothing. It's not shit coins. It's just a trade-off. Again, similar to layering trade-offs in many ways, and simple. And don't have the trade-offs are made in a different way. In other words, you don't set up a watchtower to make sure somebody's not robbing you, and then in order to prevent that, have to close out your channel and pay your Bitcoin fee. Right? You just maybe watch for a double spend. That's it.
I suppose also you don't have to set up your own little node and be online for you to receive payment. You could just disseminate an address and get payment.
Well, yeah. But just take BTC and LTC, right? I usually just only deal in BTC, but the code we have, you can make a couple configuration changes in a config file and fire up the same process, same executable, it'll run Litecoin. It's very, very, very similar, right? Okay, so take these well-known things that are out there, they exist. What's the problem, right? You want to do small transactions with lower level of security. Say you're buying your coffee. Why are you so concerned about having this, multi-million-dollar level of transaction security? You're not. And
good point.
And if you can atomically swap between these chains, you can periodically take something out of your vault, which maybe is on BTC, and put it in your leather wallet, which is your LTC, and go out and I'm not promoting LTC. I'm just an example that everybody knows about, right?
Understood.
So I see that eventually someday what you might anticipate, what I anticipate is that you'll see just BTC 1 through N of declining levels of security corresponding to declining sizes of transaction value with atomic swaps between them, people paying a little more money to secure their money against double spends more highly.
How would a new sort of like let's say BTC 2 or BTC 3, how would it sort of come into evolution? Because there would be a transition effect. Human beings would start getting a little bit grouchy or something like
Well, these have already come into evolution, right? LTC is a good example, but there's hundreds of them, right? And I don't know about hardly any of them, right? I know LTC because we have it in the code base, but the way they came into being was through demand. Somebody wanted them. And if there's demand for a money like Bitcoin for smaller level transactions. If the demand is sufficient enough, it'll just come into be. And this just becomes an engineering issue, right? How do I engineer a wallet that can paper over the distinction between higher and lower levels of security?
Yeah.
That's like an interesting question. I mean, that's fun, right? Let's make one of those. And but there has to be sufficient demand. Merchants aren't taking Bitcoin. I mean, some of them are using Lightning for Bitcoin transactions, but there's just not a lot of demand for these transactions, especially in the white market, where what's the benefit, right? What's the benefit in the white market for transacting in Bitcoin? The whole point is, avoiding state control. So it really is a black market money. And, when state clamps down, the black market gets bigger. So, you may see that demand creating more transactions in other chains. And then you might see somebody making wallets that paper over that distinction. So you don't even know the difference. Why would it matter to somebody, right? Do I want to pay this fee for high security, or this fee for low security? Okay, it's a slider on my wallet. What do I care? Do I care which chain it's in? No, not if I can spend it with who I want to spend it with. So it's a perfectly rational solution. And if you're somebody that doesn't do any high security transactions, you don't need a node that has that chain, right? In other words, you're effectively horizontally sharding the history in a perfectly rational way. So I think it's already kind of happened. It's just that it's an engineering distinction, right? Like you open up, I use Edge Wallet because I know Paul Pewey, Airbits, right? And I opened it up the other day and I was scrolling through all these coins, right? And I'm just like saying you're halfway there, right? You're halfway there already. People are just doing this. If you go to some of these exchanges or whatever, the transactability between the chains is pretty transparent. It's not, we're not talking about atomic swaps, but that would be the next logical step is to just enable atomic swaps between the chains. And now you're just moving money from one level of security to another, and you pay for it, which makes sense. But yeah, you're not making the same trade-offs as you make with some of the layering solutions. You don't have to be online, you don't have to watch, you don't have to close out, whatever. It's just very simple. It's just like Bitcoin.
Yeah, there are detractions to doing layering solutions. Actually, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, because you seem to cut through the dross very quickly and easily. I've already created a new privacy preserving internet protocol based on information-centric networking. And I'd like to put something like a layer 2 on top of it. Maybe even do like coin joins or something like that. So this networking protocol allows you to do a more effective hiding. So like in my sense, from my perspective, something like a layer 2 Lightning allows you to do high frequency transactions when you need to, and when it's an off time, you can settle it later. When like in the evening or something, when business closing or something, you can settle it later. What I'm worried now, the main issue I want to discuss with you here is that, well, you have already gone into the sharding of the different blockchains, but I'm slightly concerned that a layered technology suddenly disconnects it totally. Do you see what I mean? So the concept of settlement. So the concept of settlement becomes like you're just disincentivized to actually settle.
It's worth considering that I use the dollar as an example, but Hong Kong dollars work just fine too. The current U.S. dollar note versus the original third Federal Reserve dollar, certificates. That's what the difference is, right? The dollar became decoupled from its settlement mechanism, which was gold or silver, right? And that decoupling allowed, therefore, seigniorage. Of course, it happened from the very beginning, but let's pretend it wasn't decoupled until, there was a recoupling back in 1933 and then a formal international decoupling in 1971. But really what was happening is it was immediately decoupled. Well, if you take something like I've heard people say, well, in Lightning, well, eventually everybody will just use Lightning and will never settle. I'm like, well, then you'll have no security whatsoever, right? If you never settle. And the ability to settle is what gives you that security. And if it becomes too costly to settle, so you never settle, then you don't have that anymore. So it has to remain tied to that settlement mechanism, which means that the fee pressure will always push its way up into those other transactions, right? The people that have to settle and open and close channels that have to pay those fees. So it may scale it up significantly, but it still exists, and it still has to be coupled. And that is a little concerning to think that people believe that they'll just Bitcoin just kind of doesn't need to be there. We'll just use Lightning. It's kind of silly. So layering, fundamentally layering is a credit solution, right? You're dealing in credit, and then you may be able to have a pretty strong guarantee of being able to settle that credit, but that's what it is. And it's very similar. It's just kind of a formal way that's maybe better secured doing offline transactions, say at Coinbase, right, or Cash App, where there's a lot of supposed transacting going on, but it's all being done off chain, and then you settle, and then you pay your fee when you close out. So that's what we call credit, right? These are Lightning is essentially money certificates, right? Like the dollar was the original gold-backed dollar is a money certificate. You move it around, and you don't have to move the gold around, which saves you a lot of transportation costs, whatever it may be. But then you settle, you get your gold back. It's an attempt to be a one-to-one credit system for Bitcoin, and that's fine. Money and credit are a duality. Right? There's some people that believe there should be no credit, which I find fascinating. Without credit, there's really no reason for the money, and there's no production without credit. Right? Somebody has to actually invest in production, or nothing gets produced, and there's nothing, and the money's not worth anything because there's nothing to buy. So it can't get you anything of use value, so it itself becomes useless. So that's the theoretical end game of no credit. And when people start talking about fractional reserve, which Rothbard was careful not to directly err in man, economy, and the state. But if you look at what has government done to our money, he's so misleading that people come to believe what he's saying is like there's some basis to this. But if you go back and read man, he doesn't make those mistakes. I think he's smarter than that. But I wrote a whole topic on this, called the full reserve fallacy, where like full reserve means no credit, and no credit means no production, and no production means no stuff. So you with a money certificate, one-to-one, you're really it's not credit that results in production because it remains one-to-one. It has to be loaned over time. But yeah, full reserve is a silly concept.
So a few of my mates, they're dead set. They're dead against Bitcoin. They really dislike it, and it's difficult sort of going, getting their reason for it. But essentially, it boils down to them liking the state. They say the state needs to have nukes. It needs to have an army. It needs to have these sorts of things. Sure. And some of them saying like how is science going to get funded otherwise? Because and
people don't need knowledge anymore without the state.
Say again?
Things without the state. Anyway, if you come across somebody who doesn't agree with the principle behind it, which is saving people tax money, or at least making tax more visible, then they're going to disagree. Now, this is a disagreement with the assumptions, right? You can't argue with that. right? You can't argue with somebody who says, no, we like it. We don't want to resist the state, right? We're not going to accept the axiom of resistance here. Okay, so then, like Mike Hearn, just go work on R3 or something and be a centralized system. That's what he said. And like, we can't, he didn't say you didn't want to, he said we can't, right? It can't work, so I'm going to go work on something centralized. What's the point of this? I had a debate with him back, not long before he quit working on Bitcoin. It's getting to the point where people don't even know who he is. At least the new people that are coming into Bitcoin don't know. And I'm like, well, people just don't agree with the underlying assumption, and therefore you will never get, in that case, you'll never get them to really accept the system, which is fine. This is one of the great things about Bitcoin. It's not a democracy. No, you don't have to get a majority of people to agree with you so that it'll work. You just have to get enough people to pay for it that it can resist. And it's an anarchy. Everybody does what they want. They act in their own interests. And if other people don't go along, that's fine. You still have your money. So, yeah.
I suppose it also, in some sense,
those people. Except maybe talk philosophically about the nature of the state and not really talk about Bitcoin anymore.
Yeah. No, it would be. It's a completely different conversation. I mean, when you go to the state level, I forgot the name of that. I forgot the name of that thing. We went into China, we went into America, and several research facilities. I mean, massive, just unbelievably massive research facilities, which cost billions of dollars to create. Mm-hmm. And I just look at this and I think, yeah, can you imagine these top level crypto sausages? I don't think they would ever be able to put money together to create such things.
Sure. And the more fundamental question would be, why would they? Why should they?
Exactly. No, exactly. But,
So the state is fundamentally about making people do things they don't want to do, because if they wanted to do them, the market would do it, right? Yeah. And taking, the modern equivalent of, trillions of dollars from people so that we can go to the moon and collect some dust probably wasn't a decision that most people were willing to make back then. So we forced it upon them. And we had this great program, which was all, very inspiring and helped us win the media war against the Russians, but for a time, right? So was that money that everybody wanted to spend? Well, when it's all done, it's all been spent, and it's all water under the bridge, great. But, that money would have been spent on other things that they wanted. And looking at a big factory full of scientists, doing something for the state, directed by the state, clearly state money, is not necessarily what people want. The money's going to get, capital's going to get used in something anyway. It's not, the assumption is that this is what people want. So state doesn't fund science, we don't get this. Well, if we don't get this, that means people didn't want it. Right? People wanted something else with their money. Maybe they wanted to eat, not be poor, right? And there's plenty of people in China that probably would prefer to be doing something else with their money than some of the things that they do with it, that the state does with it.
Tokamak. So, that's the word I'm looking for. We went into a tokamak, and it was a fascinating experience. Anyway, continue, please.
A tokamak reactor?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been to one of those. There was one, I don't know if it's still there, but it was in MIT in the 80s. I went down there. Yeah, that was during the Cold War too. I was like, this is really cool. We got this Russian tech at MIT. We're running it off a General Electric flywheel generator that powers Long Island or something. And they got it there. Very, very interesting. Yeah, but, they've been spending a lot of money on that for a long time. And, maybe people want to use their money for something else.
Yeah. I suppose the best way to play the game is to use Bitcoin as an inflation hedge, or just to to opt out of the system and earn. If you want to participate in cool scientific experiments, then that's where you earn your money there. You do your experience there, and then opt out of the system.
Yeah, I mean, the world was bereft of scientific discovery before the state decided that it would be in its benefit to tax people to pay for it.
Yeah.
Right. It's every Amir, Amir Taki. He's
one of the early Bitcoiners.
Yeah, he founded libbitcoin, which is the project that I work on,
Right.
and he's still around. He's doing stuff. And oh geez, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, he made this funny comment. He came, he's a Brit, and he came to the States, I think, for the first time, and I met him on that trip down at Cody Wilson's place in Austin. He was still living on the college campus after I guess he was done with college. He was a law student there. And so it was Cody, me, and Amir, and Peter Todd, and Andy Greenberg, who writes for Wired, used to write for Forbes or something, and a few other people. Patrick Straitman, who was with Amir when they started libbitcoin, and he was one of the largest miners. I think he works for Blockstream now. So we had a grand old time there, and I'd already met Amir. I had gone out to Spain, meet him when I first started on the project, but he wanted to introduce me to some of these people. I was still kind of new, so we had this great time. But he was fascinated by some of the things about the States. And one of the things that happened to him in New York was, so he'd come through Manhattan, and he was riding the subways, and he jumped a turnstile or something. He got put in subway jail by transit cops in New York. And they were tough, and that was some other issues. I don't know. Maybe it's not true, but it was a story I heard. And one of the things he commented on was the roads. And he's like, when you're libertarian anarchist types, in the US, it always comes back to the roads. Like, who's going to build the roads, right? And how would we possibly have roads if we didn't have the state, right? Oh, okay, we gotta go to the moon because we need roads. So his observation was like, we don't use that example in England. And I always wondered why you guys were always talking about the roads, but now I get it. Look at these roads. They're amazing. and he said, we talk about healthcare, right? And this was, I think this was back a few years. I know the NHS in the UK is always the number one political issue.
Yes.
It's so bad. And some people think it's great, but it's actually one of the lowest rated healthcare systems in the world. And for a number of categories and reasons. And there was always, never enough money, whatever. It's always about this, and the same thing in the roads in the US. We need infrastructure projects. We got to fix our roads and bridges. And he's like, in England, we don't know how we could possibly get healthcare without the state. And it was an interesting observation because, every little region has their pet thing that the state, that it just couldn't exist without the state, but they're not all the same thing, right? And England has this long tradition that predates state road involvement, which is very fascinating, right? Roads evolved before the state got involved pretty extensively. I mean, this is true pretty much everywhere, but it's a fairly modern, not too long back history of it. And then the state eventually, the lords and whatever, seized the roads, and then they taxed people to pay for the roads, and then they kept the tax money, and the roads went to shit because they were really well maintained by merchants and farmers and stuff who needed to trade across these roads, right? And paid people for rights of way and maintain them, or communities maintain them for self-interest or whatever, and the state steps in, the roads all go to shit. And so they had in the US we had this long tradition of private medicine, right? And then the state steps in and it all starts going to shit, and we're surprised, and now it's become a big issue here too. But somehow we managed to go quite a long time without the state controlling it. We still have some semblance, some small corners of free market stuff left in healthcare. But then I had to take a couple trips down to Singapore for with my son for medical stuff. And because they have kind of two medical markets. One is largely a free market, probably one of the freest in the world, and the other is a state-run system, and they're kind of separate, right? So you can't afford to go to the market system; you just go over here, right? But the market system is, it's not subsidized as far as I know, and it's very lightly controlled. And it's one of the interesting things is you go to a lot of countries. If you go to England and say, I'm here to use some of your healthcare, right? They'll probably shoot you at the airport. And I show up I show up in Singapore, and this airport was interesting because my middle name is Krishna, and Singapore is half it's like a third Indian, Chinese, and European descent, right? So the woman working at the immigration was Indian, and she looked at my passport and she looked at me. She's like, "Krishna, how'd you get that name?" Right? That was awesome. And then she says, "What are you here for?" I'm like, "Medical tourism." She's like, "Oh, come use some of our medical care," because believe it or not, you pay them for it, and they therefore want more customers, and therefore when they get more customers, they don't have a shortage. They hire more doctors and they build more buildings, right? So we went in, and it was funny. My son initially called them, and he said he called it was Raffles Hospital, Singapore, and he said, "I'd like to make an appointment with this, somebody in this department." And they said, "No." He said, "I'd like to see somebody in this department." And they said, "Okay." And he said, "Can I make an appointment?" They said, "Well, you don't need an appointment. Just show up." And he said, "Any times?" "Yeah, there's always somebody here." And so we did. We just showed up and saw the heads of 5 departments. Most of them were Western trained doctors who had gone there to practice this type of medicine. People from all around the world. Excellent, actually. And before we went into every office, we got a bill. We got every single thing was itemized. Everything, whatever it was, little details, it was all itemized. Even if they have a Band-Aid, it was on there, right? And ran a credit card through the machine, and went on the way out. So we got a bill, we paid it, and went to the next one. And everybody had a little credit card machine at the front desk, and it was really simple and very cheap. And we had to do an MRI, and in the States, you can wait weeks or months to get scheduled into one of those things. And I remember I had a sports injury, and I had to go through like 2 months of therapy, physical therapy, before they would let me go get an MRI. And then afterwards, the surgeon said, "Yeah, you can't fix that with therapy." And I was like, I know, but they're preserving this scarce resource instead of just buying another one, right? Yeah. And we went there, and they're like, "Yeah, just go down the hall. It's right there. Just get your MRI." And So anyway, that's the kind of experience with the roads, healthcare, et cetera, is that when the state takes it over, it becomes awful, and then people think they can't live without the state. They lose a collective memory of having done these things, or the possibility of doing these things as a market. But fundamentally, the market produces everything. Even if it's state run, the market's producing everything. It's just being run through this bureaucracy. So,
admittedly, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate there, asking that sort of question. I for one, say,
sure, you get me going.
No, that's intentional.
Yeah, I know.
I have a very similar experience out here in Hong Kong. I mean, with the medical system out here, it's top quality. It's top quality. I mean, like just even if I were to use the state level stuff, I broke my clavicle. Had a kidney stone. It cost me like 200 Hong Kong dollars. And it was public service. I was checked into this thing, and a couple of days checked out again, paid $200, and then that's it. It was, yeah.
I mean, market supplied things are as cheap as they can be made.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, admittedly, I mean, this is the government is paying for that one. But I mean, like, if I wanted to go get like a MRI or there is also a whole private section of medical systems out here. It's equally good, if not better. Yeah. So
you run into problems when the private market has to compete with the state now too, right? The state generally runs private market out of business because they can operate at a loss. So competition is what controls price, and in a competitive market, you get the lowest price you can get. Right? That's inherent in free markets. As long as competition is allowed, you will get the lowest price possible.
Yeah.
And when you start restricting, like in the U.S., there's a number of states, and California has this. I think we have it here in Washington, where if you want to build a hospital, you have to get all the other hospitals in the region to sign off on it. In other words, they can just prevent their own competition. So it's extremely competitive, state-controlled system. Right? That's a law. That's not the market saying we don't want a new hospital. That's the state saying we're going to protect these hospitals so they can charge higher prices, and that's why they don't want competition, because they will have to reduce their prices.
Yeah.
And therefore, when you have price controls, you get shortages, and you end up then with tax subsidies, which increases the price, but it's largely paid by the taxpayer. But if you don't want to participate in that system, you're paying a much higher price because everybody else is subsidized. So you get these huge market distortions, and that's what we've seen over the U.S. And people say we have a free market over here, but it's not even close anymore.
Why do you choose to live in the States then? I mean, given that you've seen so much of the world,
It's there's a number of reasons, and one is I was born here. I have friends and family here, and another reason is just feels like home, right? I've been to 81 countries, and I've looked for places to live, found a couple that I thought were nice, and then looked at their tax structures and went, holy shit. Not only, so I'm going to pay my U.S. taxes wherever I am anyway, right?
Good point, yeah.
And, if they have a tax agreement, I'll only pay the additional amount. But, wealth taxes in Spain and, all kinds of, it's just insane. I mean, U.S. has got sure has their taxes, but that's one of the reasons why it's, the most productive market in the world is because it has relatively low taxes compared to the rest of the world. So, you give up your citizenship and go to a higher tax place, right? There's no benefit for that. It's a good passport, right? To have living somewhere else as an expat. It's definitely a possibility for me. This was kind of the year where that was an opportunity for me, and the Rona made it very difficult. I was actually looking at getting a house in Costa Blanca in Spain, and couldn't go there. So I went to Mexico for a month, and I'm like, it's not much different down there than it is up here. I can get good Mexican food here. Practice my Spanish. I can go there whenever I want. It's not like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Why do you live in Hong Kong?
Well, I was traveling the world when I was younger, when I was about 23, 24. I'd done Europe, and then I wanted to go over to Asia because I wanted to learn Chinese. And I spent time in Taiwan, and Taiwan's great. I really enjoyed it, but I had to come through Hong Kong for travel visas. So every 3 months or 6 months, I'd have to get a visa. And every time I came through Hong Kong, I remember the first time I came into Hong Kong, my jaw dropped. As a South African, we have these clear, open skies with almost very, very few skyscrapers. So coming into Hong Kong was this surreal experience. It felt like coming into a Blade Runner movie. And I loved it. Every time I came here, I couldn't wait to come back to Hong Kong. So, eventually it reached a point, like whenever I was flying into Hong Kong, it felt like I was coming home. So then I was like, okay, I need to make Hong Kong my home. This is the place to be. It's so efficient. Everything is just so efficient, from the transportation system to the internet. And one of the main reasons of coming out here was because internet was just so good compared to South Africa, which is, it's just a monopoly run, just trash shit.
So I love Hong Kong. I mean, I almost went, it was either right before or right after my conference, and things were getting hard because of the Rona, and then there was some troubles there in Hong Kong, and my business contact there didn't want me to come, I think. And so I didn't go, but I'm wondering, like, what's it like now?
Hong Kong's, I mean, like a lot of the protests have all settled down. I mean, things from a day-to-day living haven't changed that much. There's a visceral understanding that the CCP is now in play, and you actually can lead a very good, free lifestyle. You've been to China, you should know, like, there's a lot of freedom out there, but just don't cross the CCP.
Yeah, that's
don't cross the CCP.
That's the golden rule in any kind of strong state is state comes first, and everything. A lot of times, like you're right, in China, in mainland China, there's a degree of freedom that people have that people in the West don't really understand, because
no conception of
law is far more arbitrary there than in the West, and as a result, people don't even know what's legal half the time. They just know what people get away with, and they do it.
Yeah.
And they, and a lot of times that's just how it is, right? You just do what you can, and so yeah, it's a very, very dynamic, bustling, but there's also this overarching level of oppression which reaches out into the rest of the country. Most Westerners don't see beyond the economic zones. And I took a train from bullet train from Shanghai to Beijing, and went through town after town that identical concrete, block things is sticking out of some fields somewhere. And one of them we stopped at. We had to stop, and we're on the bullet train. We stopped for like an hour or two, and just no explanation of why or anything. We're just on this train stop in the middle of nowhere, like rice fields or something. And then all of a sudden another train pulled up next to us, and some party dignitary got on with like a general carrying his suitcase and standing at the front of the train on the the train stations at salute until that train pulled away, and then we could go. Right? We couldn't slow down this thing that was going on. But I just remember looking at all these towns out there, and then my son went right when he finished high school. He went out to central China, did some traveling. He had a friend lived out there, and I didn't personally do a lot of traveling outside the economic zones, but been there a few times, and I like it. China's really interesting, great people and everything, but it's two different countries, and I think people don't like my generation. I remember watching Tiananmen on television when it was happening, and that's kind of the impression that people had in the West. There was very little information, and my son took one of the courses he took was on the history of this area, and since then there's been quite a bit more learned about what actually happened, and I just didn't even know. But China was in full-on rebellion, from what I understand, at least along the coast and what are now the economic zones. And during this time period also is when you were seeing the Soviet Union start to fall apart. And presumption is that the party decided they needed to loosen up some in these areas where people had rebelled. The one that was caught on camera and focused on was in Beijing, in Tiananmen, but it happened in a number of places. And actually Beijing is not, I don't think, an economic zone. It just has a special status. But the other places, Shanghai and a few other cities, mostly along the coast, they have different laws, right? And everybody else in the country is, it's old school, right? And that's what he observed. As a visitor, you have to go check in at the police station every time you go to get to let them know you're there. In the big cities, you don't notice it because the hotels do it for you. They
all accurate.
Yeah,
all accurate.
Yeah, so it's I don't know. I forget what the subject was. So just the freedom that people have, right? So even though it can be very oppressive in a lot of ways, the day-to-day life can be even more liberal than we see in the West, because people just ignore, don't understand the laws, and they just do what they do.
Yeah, I'm sort of at the point now where I would be more happy with this government than, like for example, Hong Kongers now. They were always west-facing, very rarely looking back to China, and and as a result, Hong Kongers knew more about what was going on in the West than what they knew was going on in China. So again, just as you had understandings about Tiananmen Square and not knowledgeable about just how much progress China has actually made, Hong Kongers were in a similar sort of position. Maybe not to the same degree, because there's always been mediation between the West and China, at least on products and building products, that sort of thing. But I would prefer the government out here than a Western government.
Yeah. There's certainly trade-offs. I guess it depends on what you're, if you're running a bookstore, you might feel differently. But,
again, just don't cross the CCP.
I don't know how my writing and my speaking. When I spoke in Beijing, I I was careful to use the U.S. government as the example.
I think
on advice
very
by
sensible
counsel.
That's a very sensible thing to do. But I think that Bitcoin is going to rip through. Well, I'm kind of we might be prophesizing things here, which we don't do this during this particular conversation because I know how you're so against it. But yeah, I think Bitcoin is going to be ripping through the treasuries, the treasury balance sheets of everybody, governments, main actors and families and individuals. And I think it's going to bring a lot of honesty to.
I mean, that's really the key observation. I make that somewhere in the book that Bitcoin might not even reduce tax, right? I mean, if you can't tax the money and you still want the same amount of money, you'll just go to people's houses with your guns and take it, like the good old days, right? Not that there wasn't inflation in the good old days, but it's not necessarily going to reduce overall tax. It gives individuals a way to opt out of some portion of it, but it may be recaptured somewhere else. But the point is that it has the opportunity to make tax much more transparent, and that's sounds like what you were referring to, right? And if people got a bill every year for the amount of tax that is taken through inflation, they might actually care some more. They don't. People in the West don't even really understand. The vast majority of people have no inkling of how money is a tax system. And it's interesting if you go to other parts of the world where they've had, high or even hyperinflation, they understand it very well. I spent some time in Zimbabwe, which is a great place to go if you want to learn about money. They called the last Zimbabwe dollar that failed, they called it the fourth. That was the name of it. You can go to Wikipedia, it's called the fourth. It's the fourth dollar under one administration, under Mugabe, right? Failed 4 currencies.
Wow.
And while I was there, I had already spent, I don't follow news or stuff, but every once in a while something catches my eye, and I read this article about what was happening a couple years earlier after the fourth. And so I had some background on it, and I went there and I talked to my driver. It took me around. I was trying to get to an ATM. I was really just trying to get some cash, and he's like, they're all empty. It was. So what I had read about, I was seeing the next phase of it happening. It was really fascinating. What happened when the fourth failed, and probably in precursors, is that people just, it was so hyperinflated, they got to $100 trillion notes with timestamps on them. They expired. Yeah, 100 trillion. I bought some of these. I paid $20 for a $100 trillion note. So they
the timestamp.
They still have value, and I bet that $20 is more than it was worth when it failed. So they've gone up in value because they're becoming more scarce. But anyway, I bought a whole series. Right now, I have Italian lira from back when they used it. I have all these different monies and stuff. It's not much of a thing of mine, but I thought Zimbabwe was special, so I got that. And I got those little animals in the window you see back there at the same mark. I got elephants. The Zimbabwe dollars. That's the big 5. And so what had happened is people stopped using the Zimbabwe dollar and they started using dollars, rand, and euro. And the government had to use it too because they couldn't spend their own money; it was worthless, and nobody would take it. And so they had regressed to or progressed to a foreign currency standard, de facto standard. And then eventually, what happened is people started putting their money into their banks. And this is another kind of pet peeve of mine. People say people don't have access to banking in all these corners of the world. And I don't know. I've been to like a dozen countries in Africa, driving in the southern, South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, whatever, up north too. And everywhere I went, there's banks everywhere, right? And people can use the banks. And they're actually nice, new, modern, clean. They got ATMs, parking lots, whatever, even in small dirt towns. It's not a lack of banking access. People don't want to use the banks because they get robbed. And this is what was happening in Zimbabwe. And somebody, I don't know, it was a journalist, somebody had written an article about it. And so people put all their money, they're putting their currency, their foreign currency into the banks. because and eventually they get to the point where they have some savings and they want to be able to use credit cards, and they want to be able to, maybe ATMs, credit cards, but they want to be able to buy stuff online on Amazon, but they want to do, international commerce. They need to, and they can't because the banks don't have agreements with these other foreign banks. So eventually they progress to the point where the Zimbabwean banks set up accounts in European banks that were dollar, euro, and rand accounts. Maybe in South Africa for rand, but they set up accounts, and so that they could, transfer money into these accounts and therefore have access to the credit card network and the financial clearing network, et cetera. So now people have their money in their banks and they can use their credit cards, and everything's good. Everything's working normally, free market, aside from the fact they're using some other government's currency. And then, so what does Mugabe do? He was brilliant. He went to his own banks, which operate, under his control, and he said, I would like to take control of those European, bank accounts, and I will give you money when you ask for it. So I don't know what they call it in Zimbabwe, the Federal Reserve of Zimbabwe inserts itself between the local banks and the foreign banks, and all the money is in the foreign banks, so that so people can track that and release a large portion of it. And so, of course, the money starts disappearing. Right? He's spending it, paying the military, buying a new fancy shirt with his face printed on it or something. And
also the family has got one of the in one of the really expensive parts of Hong Kong, they have got an entire building. And
how do they pay for that? They paid for that by, probably a lot of it came from this money that was saved up from tourist and other trade in Zimbabwe that went into these European banks, and then he just came in and just did a man-in-the-middle attack, right? Like, I'll just insert myself between these. And so at that point, things were still working, and this is when I read about it. I told my son, he's very interested in these things. He was young, but this is before we did the trip out there, which he planned. And I said, we'll go see some of this on the street, And so what had happened by the time we got there, maybe a year or two later, was there was a shortage of dollars. There was a shortage of rand, dollars, and euros. So somehow they couldn't get it into the country, right? They just, I don't know, there was a shortage. Right? And this is how the government was portraying it. Like, speculators are buying them up or something, there's a shortage. Well, what really happened is they spent it all, and therefore they couldn't get any because they didn't have any, right? And so the banks, when they wanted to let people take some of their money or spend it, they couldn't. And so the banks and then eventually the state imposed, withdrawal limits. And I think they were down to like $20 a day was your maximum withdrawal. So people are, they're making real salaries, they're doing business, right? Running this tourist business, whatever. I'm like, well, why would you keep putting your money in the banks in the first place? So we go around to the ATMs. Well, even though it was like a $20 withdrawal limit, which by the way, I saw in Greece too, when they had their currency crisis a few years back.
The haircut.
Like the ATMs they all had signs on them. You couldn't get money.
That was
the credit card.
That was one of my aha moments for Bitcoin. It was WikiLeaks and Cyprus.
Yeah.
Those two things.
Well, I'm not talking about Cyprus. I'm talking about the Greece, where they had they were defaulting on their debt, and they were talking about leaving the euro, and eventually, the Germans decided to bail them out again, right?
That's the one. Okay. Yeah,
so they stayed with the euro, but at the time we had come from Turkey, and sorry, my camera's going a little crazy because of the contrast. At the time, they were. So this is what happened in Zimbabwe. So there's this driver. We were staying in a wildlife camp, and the driver had been taking us around. So I asked him to take us into Vic Falls and just see if we can find an ATM. And he grew up there, so he knew people, and he knew like the guards working. There was always a guard standing by the ATMs, and he would just he would look at him. The guy would see me and look walking towards the ATM. The guy would just shake his head, and he'd be like, "No, this." And so they were all empty. I think we went to like 6 ATMs. They were all empty, and there was just no. The banks didn't have the money. Right? They couldn't give it out, and there were so we went to a bank the next day. We eventually ended up taking a ride over the bridge to Zambia, and we got some Zambia bucks, which were easy to get, and just to have them and get into another country and have the experience. But that day we went to one of the local banks. There was 2 or 3 on the street next to each other in Big Falls, and there was a line of people out in front. There were women, sitting on the lawn having picnics with their kids, while husband, typically is waiting in line, and they're just waiting. The line's not moving, right? And I asked the guy, so what's going on over here? He's like, oh, people are trying to get their money out. They wait all day, and maybe they'll get their $20 or whatever. Right? And so we went into one of these banks, and we didn't have to wait in line because we weren't trying to get money out. And they had just started a new currency, but they didn't call it the Zimbabwe dollar this time. They called it the bond note. And they had
so this is number 5.
Yeah, this is the 5th, I guess. They had posters up highlighting the details of the money and how the advantage of this money is it had all these security features. It was kind of plasticky, unlike the old ones are like US dollars or kind of paper, but these they have all these security features, and they had this like diagram of all the lines and arrows pointing all these features out, and they were selling bond notes for $1, $1, one bond note. It was a 1-to-1, and you get, so we went in there and gave them $5. We got, I think it was 5 bond notes, and they were
another scammy ICO.
Yeah, they were very happy to give it to us. I was curious what would happen if we went back the next day and tried to buy dollars with the bond note. But anyway, I don't know. My son has these tucked away somewhere. But so we're talking to the driver, and this goes back to my point about people understand how this stuff works, right? We go back and talk to the driver, and I said, so what's going to happen over time with these bond notes? And he did this thing with his hands where he went like this. He just, here they're now 1-to-1, right? $1 bond note, but he didn't even have to say anything. He just went. They're going to decouple and they're going to inflate the crap out of it, and it's going to happen again. But so people could no longer get their. I don't think you could buy dollars with the bond notes, but you could buy bond notes with the dollars. And if you had a dollar account, Euro, Rand, whatever, in one of these banks, presumably they started giving you bond notes for what were your dollars, right? So they restarted this. Sorry, my camera is just not having a good time with the contrast. They started they rebooted this other currency, and last I checked, they were already fully decoupled. So they were, but I haven't looked in a while. But it was fascinating. And then so this driver, he ended up taking me to his property. He had a little piece of property outside of town, and it was a house he was building. It was all in different stages of construction. And I thought it was fascinating. He had one room that was just filled with the highest end electronics equipment. And I was like, what's, the disparity between this one outbuilding and the rest of the place that didn't even have a roof on it or anything yet was stark. I'm like, what's up with this room? He's like, well, I got a teenager, unless I have this big stereo with these huge speakers and everything. Anyway, so there was a lot of interesting contests. And his wife showed up. She spoke like 6 languages. She was working, so he's working, driving, and he's saving up his money to become a butcher. And he's got like, I don't know, 5 or 10 cows, fenced in the area, but he's got a lot of land, and he's gonna be his own ranch. Sorry, it's not doing. He's gonna have his own ranch and slaughter cows and run a butchery shop. And I said, okay, so first of all, why do people put money in the banks when I give you dollars for driving me around here? You're gonna put it in the bank? He said, well, it's the law. All the money you make has to go into the bank. Direct deposit is required for all payroll, and I'm sure tips, maybe don't all make it into cash payments, but so it's the law. I said, so what happens when you open up your butcher shop and somebody pays you in cash? Do you put it in the bank? It's not direct deposit. He says, oh, they'll come audit me, and they'll make sure that my money is going into the bank. So it's not a lack of banking services. It's people don't. It's so bad that they have to have a law that says you must put your money in the bank so we can steal it. And when people start, working on these projects to, give banking services to
bank the unbanked, right?
Unbanked, I just roll my eyes. I'm like, you don't understand the problem here, right?
Save Africa, Jesus.
Yeah. The problem is the banks rob you because they're arms of the state. Banks don't want to do this. They don't want to keep robbing their customers, and it's not good business. They were doing fine before he stepped in and did this. So they understand how the money works. They understand that it's a tax system. They do their best to avoid it. Bitcoin may be able to help people avoid it, and that's great. In the West, people don't understand how the money system works, and it's generally because governments have had some awareness of the consequences of going too far. Where we are right now, who knows? We've entered new territory in most of the West, so we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, so like in one of the interviews you had, excuse me, one of the interviews you had recently. Okay, before we go into that, earlier on you mentioned Bitcoin is a fiat.
I'm going to try to fix this contrast by turning off the screen behind me. Moving the camera over a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe let me turn some light. I think it's the low light.
Yeah. At least I can see your view now.
Yeah, you see the lake?
What a lovely view, hey?
That's the sunset. It's usually a beautiful sunset. That's let me see. So that's Seattle. Those buildings right there, that's downtown Seattle. And that's directly, it's a little bit southwest, so it's right where the sun sets.
Okay.
It's great. You get some pictures of Vietnam there that I picked up in Hoi An.
Oh, yeah.
My African animals there on the windowsill.
Those pictures look very familiar. We could well have walked past similar. I mean, they're everywhere, really.
They give such a good feeling. They're so light, and
they do, yeah.
Yeah, Hoi An's
a great feeling
on a river in central Vietnam.
So the U.S. government. Okay. Oh yeah. You mentioned earlier on that Bitcoin is a fiat. Do you want to go into that?
Well, a fiat is not state money. A fiat is money without use value. In other words, it's a pure money. Gold has use value. You can use it for other things, right? Dollars have use value. You can roll them up and snort coke with them. You can use them for toilet paper or wallpaper. So, Bitcoin has use value. You can use it for timestamping, but we consider these marginal use values. So there's no pure fiat, right? I don't know of any money that doesn't have some use value, but we consider the dollar. It's by far its primary use is just as a money, and Bitcoin as well. Gold, the majority of gold is that's mined every year is more than 50% goes into jewelry, and there's all kinds of industrial uses, whatever. So it has use value. If it wasn't used as a money or a certain type of money, it'd still be usable. So fiat just means no use value. Right there on the Wikipedia page, straightforward, right? So Bitcoin is a fiat. But it's important to people get emotional about it. Fiat, fiat's government money. Like, no, government money is not even in the definition. It's not even in the description. It's, a lot of government monies are fiat money. But so it's important to be rational about these things, right? Because a fiat money is not a bad money. What makes government or state money? What makes it a bad money? The fact that it's monopoly produced, right? If you can prevent everybody else from making dollars, you can make them and spend them at circulating value and make them. The U.S. dollar is made for like 5 cents, and I think a $100 bill is made for like 20 cents. So the difference is profit, which means tax, right? It's the reduction of value. But if everybody was legal, I mean, people do, right? I'm sure, the North Korean government probably makes dollars. So people do, but people illegally compete with all kinds of state-controlled monopolies. But they keep it under control to the point where they can extract a premium. So it's the monopoly production. If everybody was able to make their own dollars and they were just as good, they looked exactly like dollars, right? What would be wrong with that? It wouldn't be wrong, right? You'd have to carry an awful lot of dollars around. But once it got to the point where the cost of producing, once the price of it dropped to, it would continue to drop as people are making them. But then at some point, there's no profit in making them because the cost of making them becomes the value of them. That's what happens with all products, right? And when I reasoned this out, which wasn't too hard, I decided to take a look at some currencies that have been demonetized. I looked at Vietnam at first because I was traveling there, and there are no coins in Vietnam. The problem with coins is, it's like a bimetallic standard, right? The cost of producing the coin deviates from the cost of producing the paper, and therefore you have to withdraw the coins from circulation. But people don't give them to you because they're worth more than they paid for them, right? Silver dollars in the U.S. Who's going to trade them in for 2 for a paper dollar? The old actual silver ones. So people would collect them. Stepfather had a drawer full of them. So they get rid of the coins. That's kind of a side story, when you talk about coins. But when you talk about the paper, so they only have paper, and the smallest node I think is 1,000 dong. So what happened to the 1 dong? Right? They didn't start at 1,000. They're gone. And you look at the 1,000 dong node, and it's flimsy, right? It almost looks like actual monopoly game money, and not very expensive to produce. So you look at the purchasing power, the exchange rate between the 1,000 dong and the dollar, and I think it's like 5 cents, right? And I'm like, okay, so if the US dollar costs about 5 cents to make, this thing doesn't cost 5 cents to make, right? It's probably a couple of cents. So I'm like, give it a couple more years, right? The dong will be gone, because now the profit on a 1,000 dong note for the state is what? 100%. Costs 2 cents, you sell it for 4 cents or 5 cents. That's not bad. It's still worth it, right? But eventually it won't be worth it, and it'll just cease to be produced. And it's that production which is where the tax comes from. So money gets, money becomes demonetized over time. With coins, you have to start producing them. In the U.S., coins are produced at face value. The Fed pays the Treasury face value for the coins, 25 cents for a quarter. It pays 5 cents for a dollar. So there's no profit in the coins. And as they become more expensive to make, right? If they became 50 cents to make a quarter, right? You got a problem. And so you're losing money. So you reduce the quality of the metal. And that's, you see our pennies have been shrinking for years, right? They're lightweight. I don't even know what they're made of anymore, but they're not copper. So eventually the coins, you can't really make a physical coin. I mean, you make them out of wood or, wooden. My grandfather used to joke about wooden. Don't take any wooden nickels, during the Depression. I'm like, a wooden nickel is probably worth more than 5 cents now. But so that point at which, so imagine we go back to the original story. Sorry, I digress. But if there was no monopoly protection, and everybody just validated the dollar. You look at it, it's got certain criteria. You got a machine says, yep, that's a real dollar. And anybody can make them as long as they validate. And they cost, somewhere 5-10 cents to make. People just start making them, and they're making them. And then there's enough of them out there that it's, they're not going to make them anymore until enough get destroyed that it becomes worth making a few more. And they just kind of maintains a steady state of that'd be worth about 5 cents. Okay, so you got to carry, 1 paper dollar around for every nickel you want to spend. Yeah. It's not great, but it's what the Vietnamese do, right?
Yeah.
And state money. So it is how it would work, right? And it's the monopoly protection that prevents people from competing to increase the supply, to bring the price down, which is what happens in all markets. So it's not the fiat nature of it. It's not the fact that it has no use value. It's the fact that it's monopoly produced. It's produced under monopoly protection. And therefore, production of it creates seigniorage revenue until that production has gotten to the point where it costs more to produce than the thing can yield by spending it. And so they stop producing it and they monetize something else, and they keep going until they get to 100 trillion. And they, maybe they chop off some zeros, they remunerate it, or they just cancel it and start over at 1, which happens over and over again. So it's really obvious cycle with simple economics, but it has nothing to do with the fact that it's fiat. It's monopoly control. So I call it lowercase m monopoly money. And so people don't misunderstand me. I usually just say state money. So Bitcoin is produced by a free market. Anybody can go out and make Bitcoin. and it's produced at the cost of producing it. So it'd be like producing $1 at 5 cents, at current 5 cents price, right? So is there any inflation in that? No, it's not inflationary. And this is another thing that I ended up writing about because I thought it was an interesting economic observation, right? Producing anything in a competitive market is not inflationary. Dollars, Bitcoin, cars, you produce them, not inflationary, right? So the inflation results strictly from signers, monopoly protection. You're producing them and extracting a higher price from everybody who receives them than you paid to make it. Mm-hmm. So if you have monopoly protection for anything, you get higher prices, right? You get inflation. That's why you have monopoly, so you can do that, right? You don't have competition to bring your price down. So anyway, that's fiat.
I see. Okay, that's great. Is it worthwhile introducing the concept of credit into Bitcoin on a higher layer? Credit, debit, debt.
Nobody needs to introduce credit, and it's not something that can exist in the way we think of Bitcoin. Credit is lending somebody money. Right? So I'm gonna hold on to the thought, maybe write it down, but I'm gonna digress on something I thought was very interesting. I wrote a topic about it. I'm trying to remember his name. So I can't remember his name. I feel bad. I had met this guy in Hong Kong at Scaling on a rooftop party, and we had a long talk. He had written an alternative implementation of Bitcoin in another language or whatever, and then sold it. I forget his name. It's going to come to me. He passed away about a year or two ago.
Him. I don't know his name. No. Gareth told me about him.
Anyway, sure. I feel bad. I knew it. My memory is awful, especially with names. But anyway, so I knew him just that once, and we had both done implementations. I was working on the Bitcoin, and so we had a nice talk about it. Later, this was years later, he introduced it was on Bitcoin Dev. He posted a note and he said, "This is what I'm working on," and I was like, "Ugh, this is not a good idea." And it has nothing to do with implementation. I very rarely end up looking at implementation details. I look first and foremost at the economic impact of these things and the consequences and behavior. And we ended up having a long back and forth about it on Bitcoin Dev, the mailing list. And it was, since I wrote the topic, risk-free rate of return fallacy or risk-free return fallacy or something like that. And this has to do with lending money. And basically what he was advocating for was a new opcode in Bitcoin. And this has been discussed for other reasons or maybe similar reasons in the past, a covenant. Now, a covenant, for those at home who don't know, in Bitcoin it's a theoretical opcode, which is a script instruction that has this behavior where the coin can be returned. This is one of the ways to look at it. The coin can be returned to, say, a spender after, say, a certain amount of time. So this is a time covenant, time or height, whatever, right? So you spend some Bitcoin to somebody, and then after a certain amount of time goes back, it just magically is yours, or maybe some other criteria, right? And then it's yours again. That person doesn't have it, right? You do. And this has been proposed to guarantee certain behaviors. And his idea was that
such as
lending, right? So in this case, this was about lending. So you lend somebody some Bitcoin under a covenant. They pay you upfront interest. So you get the interest upfront. So say it's 10% interest. You get 10%, and they get the money to use for, say, a year, right? So you lend them 1 Bitcoin, you get 0.1 Bitcoin. At the end, you get your principal back as well. Sounds naively ideal, right? We can guarantee this principal return. But what has actually happened is that person who borrowed the money did it so they could produce something, right? They wanted to do something with it. They didn't want to sit on it, right? and sit on it for a year. I prove to people I have a Bitcoin and then give it back. So when they spend it, it goes to somebody else, and somebody else has traded something for it. So I went and bought a car, and I got the car. Somebody else has got my Bitcoin, all right? My borrowed Bitcoin. And that person who sold me the car then goes and pays their suppliers for all the parts and whatever that they took to make the car. So these suppliers now have some of my Bitcoin, and they've got the parts. And then these suppliers are paying their employees and, whatever miners are digging up metal parts and whatever, making batteries, so they can supply those parts. And then at the end of this chain, after a year goes by, the people who are at the end of the chain are all bag holders. They're just all bag holders, right? They got nothing. And I'm like, this is the ultimate scam coin, right? Like, and so the value of that money after 1 year is zero, right? Now that's what it would be. I borrowed it and I paid it back. It would still be, I'd still have zero of it, but I produced something in return. And that profit that I made in production is how I paid it back. Or I just didn't use it at all and I paid it back and I wasted my interest. So the idea here was, that was just a clear error, because what happens, it was hard for me to, I wanted to clearly put it into words, right? I want some math behind this. So like this doesn't make sense. So I finally used the concept of imputed value, right? If I know something is going to be worthless, like, so the last person that's getting it on the last day, they know it's worthless. They're not going to take it, right? Tomorrow it's worth zero. I can't pawn it off on anybody else. It's like, what do you call it? A demurrage money, right? Demurrage money, it's like visible inflation. You pay a tax to be able to spend the money, to be able to use the money after a certain date. There's been a lot of countries that have tried this in the past, right? Demurrage it's a fee for holding something. It goes back to old shipping terminology. But so it's like a demurrage money where, after a certain amount of time, it's 100% tax on the money. And so with demurrage money, what people try to do is spend it as fast as they can, because every day it becomes worth less and less and less, right? So that person that is going to get on the last day knows it's worth zero, but the person who's going to spend it to them knows that as well. So they know they're not going to be able to spend it then. And this zero value gets imputed all the way back to the first transaction, where the first person who gets it knows nobody's going to take this money because it's going to be worth zero, right?
It's
and
like a Cantillon
the
effect.
current value is also zero, right? You're paying somebody for something that's worth nothing. And the only way this works is if they don't know it, which means it's inherently a scam, if you know it, right? And so I'm like, this was not his intent, right? I honestly maybe just didn't understand this. And I was like, this is, we got to the point where he couldn't really argue it anymore. So we diverged on another aspect of this, which was using the borrowed money for tagging, so essentially a colored coin-like concept, where I would track things. I would track something for a year, and then when I'm done with the tracking, you get it back, right? But I found that interesting as well, because paying interest, right? So I did a little bit of like pseudo math. I'm like, the amount of Bitcoin you need to track something is, 1 Satoshi, right? Let's set aside like relay standardness rules, whatever. Like the smallest amount you would need to track something is 1 Satoshi, because that's the smallest transactable amount. If you can get somebody to mine it. And let's say fees were zero, or maybe 1 Satoshi, right? For you to transact your 1 Satoshi. I think I went down to these like absolutely smallest amounts, right? Like that's what's necessary. Everything else is going to be increased expense on top of that. Like when you're moving this thing along, you're tracking it because you're transacting it. So you're transacting it and you're paying all these fees. But let's assume it's as cheap as possible. Then why would I pay interest for this? Why wouldn't I just use less, spend less money? Right? In other words, I come, demonstrating the specifics of it is not going to be very clear. But basically, it comes down to the point where it makes no sense to borrow money to do that. You're better off just taking the money you were going to prepay for the interest and using that for the tracking. So yeah, even that kind of ancillary use of this didn't make any sense. And he had referred to this as risk-free rate of return. You're going to get interest and you're going to take no risk. And that gets back to your principle, which I asked you to put a pin in, right? Which is secured lending, It doesn't exist. Right? And I don't like to use the idea, no risk, no reward. That's not really what it's about. It's just that the money has to be used to produce something in order to generate a return, which means you're trading it with somebody to get something else, and then you're selling that thing, right? That's not securable on a chain. You're not guaranteeing that somebody's going to buy what you make, and you're not. There's just no guarantees in that, right? The payback is going to be at risk because humans are, they subjectively value things. If they don't want the thing that you're making, they change their minds. They're not going to buy it. You can't pay it back. Too bad. Understood.
Okay, so let's get a little bit into the Bitcoin, libbitcoin stuff. I mean, you've probably come across a whole bunch of the early ideas in the Bitcoin space, contributed quite a bit in the form of maintaining and actually writing, hundreds of thousands of lines of code for libbitcoin. Now, are you going to be looking at supporting, for example, the latest thing that's coming in recent, as I know, is Taproot?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually, so I was.
What's your opinion on Taproot?
I don't have any problem with it. I'm first of all, I'm not a cryptographer, and when you get into the subtleties of that stuff, I kind of take people's word for it. There's a lot of good, really smart people working on some of these things, and when it makes it as far as that's made it, I have pretty good confidence in that it's going to it works the way they say it does. I'm really not qualified to critique at that level. I'm more of a software engineer. I like to I work on code that's reliable, maintainable, easy to read, functions well, and performs well when it comes to that kind of stuff. Now, when it, as we just demonstrated, when it comes to the economic principles behind some of these things, yeah, I will critique at that level. I didn't even bother reading the implementation details because it didn't matter to me, right? And with respect to Taproot, we're trying to achieve certain things, and I think those are achievable, and the limits of them are fairly well understood, and I think it's a net positive, and it's fine. I was asked to join a working group early on that was of people that had some interest, and it was some company that I was given a pitch to, and they were involved. So I joined this working group, and I usually don't I didn't do SegWit until it activated. Right now, I wrote it in like a week, and I put it in the Bitcoin, and it was all good. We don't have enough of a presence as nodes to really have to have it implemented, have something like that implemented for the purpose of activation. But if people are using something like that, that affects consensus, certainly gets implemented as a priority. So, and that's happened. That happened with previous softworks. I've been through this several times. And with Taproot, I decided to get a little bit out front because it looked to me like it was going to activate. I was involved in this group. So I went and I started, I created a branch, and it's in my repo, my personal repo right now. And I was all excited. I'm probably going to have the first implementation of Taproot. I was almost done. I had done it all. I do this all from the specs. Our code looks nothing like Core or anything else. It's never been a fork. And it's fairly, when it comes to the consensus rules and script, it's pretty straightforward code, very straightforward code. So I just went and I started implementing this and going through the specs and, reasoning things out. And I had about 90% done with script validation, consensus stuff. And then I got sidetracked. I did my conference. I did a bunch of other things. I was traveling. And if you look at my repo history for like a year and a half, I hardly checked in anything. I was working on the book, writing, and personal issues. So I didn't do it. I didn't get it out. But it would have, I don't know if somebody must have been working on a Core fork before that, but there was nothing, no pull requests or nothing were out yet. And I was like, oh, got the first implementation of Taproot. But the history is there. You can see that it was mostly done. Anyway, so yeah, I started working full time again on code about a month ago, and spent most of my time up to this point just working on build system and upgrades to platforms, and just a lot of cruft I wanted to work out. And code. I mean, code keeps moving forward a little more slowly, but I wanted to do that. So I've got a lot of this backlog that I'm working off, so that I can work faster, and then I'll get back into a couple of features. Looks like plenty of time in terms of activation to finish, get all that done, and then finish off this Taproot consensus based stuff. Then you get into like, okay, what's the impact on wallet code? Like we have a command line utility called Bitcoin Explorer or BX. It does all kinds of interesting things. It's got like 98 commands, and but I never even implemented SegWit features in that. And nobody else has yet either. But SegWit is fully implemented in the node, in the scripting system and in the node. So there's all these other things you can do. I think somebody came along and added SegWit address parsing and support. That's 32 and that kind of stuff to the code base, and then the command line utility. So that came along, and then so similar stuff will happen with Taproot. Consensus stuff will get done first, and then there'll be utility support for other things. So yeah, it's good. But I also tell people I don't really work on futures. There's all these things that are proposed, and they just accelerate. Every year there's more and more and more things that could happen. I just kind of wait till somebody's actually using it, or somebody comes along. And there's been people that come along and requested things that aren't active, and there's some Bitcoin developers that do contract work, and I kind of direct them at them and help them out, and they've worked on things that are, they're proposed, but they're not active anywhere, and they get done. If somebody wants to pay for that, it
seems like
the kind of the rule is, nothing goes into the code base unless it's
solving a problem.
It's Bitcoin, right? It conforms to the principles that I described, and there's it's not a one-off, right? It's not some custom job for whatever. That's go hire one of our guys and do some custom work, but it has to, in other words, it has to make it into the public repo, or I don't work on it.
Seems like you're a bit of the Peter Hitchens of Zero MQ, but of Bitcoin. I've interacted with Peter quite a few times, and I noticed that on your GitHub repository, you're part of the iMatics as well as the Zero MQ. So I'm betting that there's going to be an interesting formative, influence that he might have had, you two might have had on each other. What's the story there?
Well, I don't know if you know, Peter passed away a couple of years ago.
I know very well. It's affected a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay. And so we use Zero MQ extensively in the client server interface. We Amir started that, and he was a big fan of Peter's. And first thing I did when I made the decision to start working on the Bitcoin is I went out and I met Amir. I wanted to know who this guy was and that we could work together, et cetera. And we got along great. And he was a big fan of Peter's, and I started digging in eventually into the Zero MQ code, and I became a maintain. So we ended up using, I don't know if Amir was using it, but we ended up using GSL. I think it's general scripting language, which Peter had written.
Yeah, that's the
done a lot of work
FSMs.
Sorry?
FSMs, finite state machines. GSL is a DSL for making finite state machines, isn't it?
I don't know. I describe it as a scripting language. I mean, maybe Peter could get that abstract, but
yes, he could.
it basically, it takes an XML document as input data, and it has facility to parse it out and use template. It has a template language, and the script basically is the glue between the input data and the output templates, and allows you to generate code. So we have a very large repository. We have a developer library. It's not an application. It has binaries, but it's 10 repositories. System repository, network, P2P network is P2P protocol stuff. Node. There's the BX client, which sits on top of the whole client stack, and then the server, which sits on top of the server stack. Node, network. Client server protocol, et cetera. So there's 10 repositories. And we ended up with a whole repository just for the build system, and it's all GSL. And so we had a couple issues come up with GSL. I ended up becoming a maintainer. We make it back in the day when Peter ran those things, he owned the IMATIX repository because that was the name of his company. And so he made one pull request that wasn't crappy, and he made you a maintainer. So I became a maintainer of IMATIX, which had a consequence eventually, because after he passed away, nobody had access to that repo. Nobody had the access to it. Yeah. So I was able to merge code, but I wasn't an admin. So I was like the one person that was active on it. I don't know if anybody else was. And so we eventually decided to fork it over to the ZMQ repo, where another guy who I've never met, he kind of took over. And I was also a maintainer on ZMQ. There were 3 libraries we used there under when Amir had it. I got it down to just 1. So we used libzmq, and I was maintaining the Windows builds for that until they finally got some CMake builds. And because we support Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. And anyway, so when I started working on the ZMQ stuff, I decided I really wanted to go meet Peter. So I went out to Brussels and spent a weekend.
Play guitar, drink whiskey.
It was absolutely fascinating. It was such a good time. And, I remember just thinking, like, I can't wait till I come back here again and hang out. And within a year, he was passed away. It was sad. But we had some great talks. And I didn't know. I mean, he had lung cancer, and it was in remission, and I didn't know. And then it came back with a vengeance and took him.
Yeah.
So yeah, he gave me one of his books. He wrote a bunch of books. They're all very interesting, kind of wacky.
Which one did you get?
I got 2 of them. I think I bought one. He gave me the other one and signed it when I was there, but I can't remember the name.
Culture and Empire.
Yeah, I have that one.
Yeah, that was interesting, eh? Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff. He's a lot of interesting insights that fella does.
Yeah, I don't know. You're South African. He grew up in Africa.
Yeah,
and he spoke like 7 languages, and took me out to took me out to Little Congo in Brussels, and we had a great meal. And during the day, we were walking around. It was great. In Brussels, you just get a drink, have a beer, and you just walk around the streets. It's so fun. And so we're walking around the sunny day in Brussels. We stop by the river and we sit on some bleacher seats. And there's some African drum band playing, just Congo drums and whatever. And it was really cool. The guy comes up to me and he hands me some drums. And I'm awful. I'm beating on these drums. And then he goes over to Peter, and I'm like, if you know Peter, you look at him, you're like, he's gonna be worse than me, right? Like, and oh my God, he starts wailing on these drums. He's amazing, and I'm like, what the? And then later I find out it's his band. He actually started it, and they practiced in his garage, and he didn't even tell me. We were just sitting there for like 20 minutes. It was really funny. Yeah, I had a great time with him. So
he's a fantastic fella.
We did carry forward some of the principles that he had. I think Amir used his reasoning for the licensing on libbitcoin, and some aspects of process. Right, he had a very open process. If somebody contributed, he made him a maintainer. And
yeah, I have a similar
too. I probably failed to kind of keep up with that, but somebody comes in, they do some good stuff, make them a maintainer. So, most people don't stick around, but encourage participation, and encourage, merging code. And his philosophy was, if it's screwed up, people will find out, and, you'll learn your lesson. But I'm not going to stop you. If it compiles and it looks reasonable, we're going to put it in there, and then we'll work it out later. So the project moves pretty quickly, and it's a great project.
Solving problems, and it's still doing that. Okay, so what's your I wrote down credit over there. I think you've already answered the credit thing. Now we spoke more on the implementation level of Taproot, but what's your opinion on the economic benefit of Taproot, and what does it enable? Given that we're just a bunch of monkeys that are looking at this fire now, and we're just trying to understand what Bitcoin is.
Well, it's funny when I look at, like, when I'm going through 2 or 3 BIPs. Amir created the BIP system.
Yeah, right.
Right, he wrote BIP 1 because the process was so closed. He took the Python, the PIP system, and he brought it over to Bitcoin. And so I love that, a guy that never merged a single line of code into Bitcoin, into Satoshi's prototype, it's now Bitcoin Core. He created the BIP system for them that everybody uses. Yeah, so I'm going through like 2 or 3 BIPs to implement this stuff, and you can do that, and you can implement the whole thing, get all the tests passed, know that it's right, and not have any clue what it does, right? And I have some idea what it does, but like you're just making everything line up, right? So that's kind of from a high level, Taproot, from my perspective, improves privacy, maybe compresses data on the chain, allows some more creative things to be done in script. But the privacy enhancement is to me, the important aspect of it. Getting Schnorr signatures in and being able to compress multi-sig, it's more efficient and more private. But it's not a major, it's not a game-changing event, right? We still have privacy issues, and we'll have privacy.
But it is major. Because I mean that is the whole efficacy of Bitcoin, which allows you to be a rat and hide from the state.
It's not effective enough to. It's not a solution to that problem, and I don't think anybody who's working on it at a very low level is going to suggest that it is. I mean, I've seen people suggest it is not. It's a modest improvement. It enables certain things. Bitcoin moves forward at a steady snail's pace. And there's other stuff that's always going on. A lot of great experimentation in altcoins, which, it's not my expertise. I don't work on futures, but I expect these things will just continue to evolve, and privacy will continue to improve, because why not, right? What's going to stop it? My objective with libbitcoin is to provide a platform for people to build stuff on that's actually Bitcoin. Because there isn't another one. There's web APIs. You can go use Coinbase or whatever, or you can fire up an application and connect to it. Like the Satoshi client or a bunch of language clones or forks of that. And if you work in C++, I've worked in a lot of languages, and C++ is a good language for Bitcoin, for a node. Right, and it's what Satoshi chose, and
but he wasn't that much of a software engineer, right?
No, I wasn't. But he didn't write great code, but he made good decisions, and that was he certainly could have chose other things. He certainly wasn't an expert in C++ development, and that's not where you would start if you're not an expert, right? But he chose it, and he had an eye on performance, and as a systems programming language, C++ is good, and it's ubiquitous, and that's another aspect of it. It's it's widely used and ported and everything, and it's kind of a common denominator. And I'm an older guy, so all this new stuff, people doing stuff with what I essentially consider script. I don't even. To me, it's these are toys, experiments.
Oh, come on, Rust isn't that much of a toy. It's not that much of a.
But I wouldn't call Rust people script kiddies either. But and you can compile JavaScript now. But a type-safe language might be a good idea, right? And a language where the compiler can actually give you some help.
Yes.
So. I Microsoft bought my first company. I spent a couple years there, and when I came out, I brought some people with me, and I did a project for a couple years, and most of it was C# or web development. So a lot of JavaScript, a lot of C#, a lot of database work and stuff. And C#, I'd done a lot of Java work in a past life too, a lot. And I was like, this is a really elegant language. It's very Microsoft, right? It's very proprietary. It's opened up a lot, but it's very elegant. But when I looked at Bitcoin, I actually gave it a thought, because I'd just done all this C# work, and I'm like, no, it's got to be C++. This doesn't make any sense. I was aware of all the limitations of these intermediate language platforms and stuff, especially from Microsoft. That was the cause of the whole Vista debacle, was putting too much managed code in the operating system.
Sure.
Systems level programming, you want to be able to manage your own memory, and you want optimal performance and compact code, et cetera. And anyway, so I also noticed that somebody was actually working on a C# implementation, and I forget his name. He's still around, I think, working on Bitcoin stuff. What was it called? It may still be out there, but did a pretty extensive implementation based on C#. Anyway, so even though C++ would not have been my favorite environment to work in,
Yeah.
and so I looked around for what existed in C++. I spent a few days poking around Bitcoin D, and I was like, Jesus, right? This is impenetrable code. And then I somehow found libbitcoin, and I looked around it, and happened to have a close friend from college who had actually made a post to the libbitcoin mailing list, and I was like, what the heck, right? So I couldn't get a hold of Amir, so I got him to give me an intro to Amir. They knew each other, and spent some time looking at it, and I was like, this is actually pretty good code. It's very readable code, and he's making good engineering decisions, right? Good architectural decisions, even though it has had a long way to go. And I just thought it was an opportunity to actually have something to start with and work for there. I've been very happy with it. I'm not happy with the fact that I haven't gotten it quite as far as I want to get it, but done a couple major releases, and this last one I've been working on for a couple of years, but took about a year and a half off, so now I'm back. So I don't know how we got on the topic of language and stuff, but yeah, I know that some of the language ports are really have been just academic exercises. People I've talked to have written them like, yeah, I just wanted to see if I could do this in whatever,
Sure.
get a minimal node running or something.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think libbitcoin's contribution to the space is phenomenal. It's so critical, so important. I mean, if you just try to do signing of signatures, with Bitcoin D, it's just.
Well, it's an application, and the only
yes, I understand.
Is this JSON RPC, interface, which is not designed for any kind of scale or security, right? You got to co-host this thing, and that was a decision that Amir made when he said, well, if I'm going to make a node, I want to be able to communicate with it performantly, right? Instead of having everybody pull all the data out of the node, put it into some proprietary database, and then run queries over it and answer those queries and do your block explorer, right? Or whatever. That doesn't make any sense. Why not just query the thing directly? It's already a database of the data. Right?
Yeah.
So he chose the ZeroMQ API, which provides. I actually work with Peter. I hired Imatics, and he contracted it out to somebody to implement in ZMQ, which is now in ZM. I said I want it to go into the maintained public code base. It's generic, but I wanted to be able to use SOX 5 so that I could sit a node behind a Tor server. So I was running Tor and I2P at home, and I was like, oh shit, I can't do this with ZMQ because it operates at the lowest level above TCP or whatever the network protocol is, right? It's
Ethernet.
No, well, not Ethernet. It operates above, like, say, TCP, IP, UDP,
okay.
Whatever, any kind of transport protocol. It's just right on top of that, right? So it's not on top of HTTP or anything like that, like JSON RPC, right? It's a pretty low level. So the data has to be structured with knowledge of SOX, right? It wasn't possible to do just using it off the shelf. And I was not going to try to attempt that. And they knocked it out. I think I paid $7,000. They knocked it out, and it went into the main line, and it worked perfectly. I'm like, awesome, right? And I don't know if that was before or after I went out and met him. I think it was after, right after I came back. I said, hey, I want to do this. And so now libbitcoin could sit behind, and it does sit behind, Tor servers, which is great. You can be a hidden service just because of that. Now it's just a couple configuration settings in the config file, not just one. It's like another endpoint you open up. So the client server protocol, being ZMQ, was done for a lot of reasons, right? It's a much more maintainable code base. It scales out into all different types of topographies, allows broadcast, push, subscription, load balancing. I ended up getting, I was working in libsodium because they had a dependency. CMQ had a dependency on libsodium for Curve CP.
Curve, yeah.
Yeah, Peter had brought, or somebody in the organization had brought in, so Curve CP, for those at home, is an implementation of Bernstein's
Daniel Bernstein's, yeah.
Yeah, for replacement for TLS, which people call SSL, right? So server identity, server identity, packet level privacy, client identity, all the above, both if you want it. And so I ended up doing work in ZMQ to bring in. I didn't like having another dependency. I hate dependencies, right? Libsodium, and all we needed was the curve for Curve CP. And so somebody had wrote this thing called tweet-nackle. They had tweeted out, like, I don't know, 50 tweets or something, the minimal source code in C for the curve used by Bernstein's CP. And there was somebody had then pasted, put all these together into a source file, and you go on GitHub and you pull out tweet-nackle. It's one little C file, right? I'm like, why do we have this whole dependency just to do Curve CP? So I pulled in tweet-nackle, and I don't know, maybe there's some issues with tweet-nackle. I don't know, but that's not for me to decide, right? Like, to me, these are equivalent. You've proved to me that they're not. Everything came out the same. So I was able to drop the libsodium dependency, and so now I'm no longer actively maintaining a maintainer of libsodium, but I was for a while. So we got tweet-nackle in there. We got SOX5, and then there's key generation for Curve CP and then there's serialization for the key generation, and all this stuff went into libbitcoin. So the command line tool can generate keys based on a seed, emit them, in serialized format, which basically they look. If you serialize them differently, they're exactly the same as Bitcoin public and private keys, 256-bit numbers. But I use they have base 85 serialization in libzmq because I don't know, Peter thought it was cool. But so I brought, we've got base 2, base 16, base 54, base 56, base 85, base 32 now. That's what they call Betch 32, which is a brilliant name. So we got like 6 or 7, 8 different serializations of numbers. And so we took this, if I had used one of the Bitcoin serializations, it would have been horrible, right? So I use this base 85, which has all these weird characters and everything. And so we have serialization, you generate the keys, you serialize them, you take the thing, you paste it in your config file, and boom, you're done. That's it. It's, no registering with, an agency to get your certificate, SSL ways. It's completely private. You take your private key, you put it in the file, you're the server. You publish your public key. That's it. You want to be a client with identity. You put your private key in your config file, and you give the server your public key. That's it. Nothing. Just config file. And so it's brilliant. ZMQ has just been awesome. The downside to it is one, you have the dependency on libzmq, but it's very common, highly ported, every language. It's great, easy to use in things like Python and PyZMQ. The other downside is that it's not JSON RPC, right? So all this infrastructure in the Bitcoin universe, it's been built up on having your own node and then, or having a local node, and plugging in through these JSON RPC calls. We don't support, which is an adoption issue. So a year or two ago, one of the guys that works a lot on libbitcoin decided to implement a JSON RPC. Actually, I don't know if you want to get sidetracked in the story, but it's very interesting, right?
Let's go for it.
So we have this node, a node doesn't do anything. You need an interface to the node. So we have a series of libraries, and a node inherits from so we have a class, P2P network class. It does P2P, but without a place to store the data, it's just a P2P network class. You can use it for just communicating, right? So then you add on database and blockchain. Blockchain sits on top of database. And now you have something to manage the information and keep track of the chain and store it and retrieve it for you. So now you have a query interface on a simple database. That's blockchain. Take node and blockchain, put them together, and you take P2P network, which is called network, and blockchain, another library class, and you put them together into the node class, which is another library, and now you have a node, right? You can talk on the network, and you can store and retrieve data. for the purpose of talking on the network. But there's no way to communicate with it at all, except for the P2P network, unless you add an interface, right? So you can implement your own interface on top of this by inheriting from the node class or containing it or whatever, and then writing your own queries against the blockchain, which is what we did. We have server, which sits on top of node. So server is actually a class that inherits from node, and there's an executable, which is a very thin wrapper that implements command line and config file parsing only and maintains the process. So server now is basically just a ZMQ, right? We have another library called protocol, which is a set of C++ abstractions that are useful for us for sitting on top, for communicating over the network. Since you think of it as client server stubs. So server has this very small amount of code as a result for maintaining ZMQ endpoints for the different services that it wants to provide, and they're managed through the config file, and then it uses the node to get and node and blockchain to get and maintain the data. So when you're running server, you have a scalable, securable, highly performant, concurrent and asynchronous interface, both internally and through the ZMQ interface for communicating with the blockchain. Then the question is only, what information do you want from the blockchain? And then, if you want to ask complex questions, now you got to go back down the database and do indexing of whatever you want to ask. But so we index all the basic stuff, and this was Amir's, and these were all Amir's designs. I've spent a lot of time, doing various things to them, but this was his design. And one of the things he did in the last design, so early on, he had made the change from whatever database he'd used initially to using LevelDB, which is, I believe, what Core still uses. But he didn't like LevelDB. He did all kinds of performance analysis. He graphed it all out. He showed me. He's like, sucks, right? So he said, I'm going to go with memory mapped.io, which basically meant he created a series of files, one for transactions, one for headers, one for the one for the height index, one for an index. It's just simply an index of payments, which are already in the transactions, right? And that's essentially it, right? And I've modified it quite a bit since then, but it's still the same basic idea. It has drawbacks, but when it comes to performance and simplicity, it's amazing. And basically what you're doing is you're just appending to a file. You open up a file, it's a memory.
I love it.
It's the same type of file it's the same thing the operating system uses to maintain its
Sure.
Virtual memory, right? So you're not going to improve upon the operating system's virtual memory management. Otherwise, you need a new operating system, right? So we let the operating system keep evolving its improvements to memory management, and we let it decide what's on the disk and what's in RAM. It's optimizing this stuff, right? It's paging stuff on and off, and so if you have enough RAM and you're reading and writing from these files, it's all in memory. There's no reason for it to put, to be reading it off the disk. It keeps it in memory until it runs out of memory, and it's constantly moving back and forth. So the operating system is designed to do that. And so you get the structure of the data in these files is hash tables. Now these are not tables that like have the 256-bit hash as the key, right? They have in Bitcoin, when we talk about hashes, these are natural keys. They're inherent in the data, right? You run a function on the data, you get the key. Everybody sees the same key, same transaction ID. Those are natural keys. The database uses surrogate keys, which are local to the database, right? So they could be unique to the one database based on implementation, or they could be the same across everybody's. Doesn't matter because they're completely internal, and they're used to. So we have a hash table of transactions, a hash table of headers, a hash table that indexes payments, and then a simple array of heights, which are pointers into the headers, and so which basically maintains the path of the tree. And hash tables have this characteristic of constant time lookup. I mean, worst case, you have linear lookup, but it depends on how many hash conflicts you have, and you can manage that if the data is fairly predictable. And Bitcoin data is very, predictably random, essentially. So you get very highly dispersed. And Amir did a bunch of analysis on this, and we end up with an average of 1.5 items per bucket. In other words, very, very little hash collision. So in other words, when you do a lookup for something, you go direct, you run a little math function, you go directly to the memory offset, and there it is, right? It's on the disk, but once it's been read once or just got written, it's in memory, right? So little math, boom, read it out directly from memory.
Fast as greased lightning.
Serialize it, and then what do you got to do? You got to send it out to somebody who asked for it, right? So you go through ZMQ. So if you're in another process on the same machine, ZMQ defaults to I don't know what on different machines. What's the protocol? Anyway, it's gonna drop down to the most efficient protocol. So if you're in process, it doesn't even move out of the memory space, right? It's the same memory. It just moves it from here over to here, and now you've got it. So if you're writing your own server, which we do, right? We're using ZMQ as this interface, but it's not being reserialized or anything like that. If you're doing it on the same machine, it's out of process, so it enters a new memory space, but it's using a very efficient local network protocol. If you move it to your LAN, you could use a different protocol. If you move it over the internet, you could use another one. If you want security, you could add cryptCP. These are all additional costs, but they're much lower in terms of overhead than you get from something like HTTP or SSL. That's ridiculous by comparison, right? So, so very efficient. But then you also get there's so many interesting aspects to, and it's not certain. None of these are my areas of expertise. Again, I'm just kind of a generalist, but in ZMQ, you have one of the things that Peter discovered, learned over years of working on large corporate and government systems that were doing messaging back in the earlier days was, how to do messaging. It's called
JP Morgan
for a reason, right? It's no message queue. And it's just brilliant, right? And when I finally figured it out, like how do I manage? Say I have 10,000 clients, right? And I got to broadcast to these clients, but this one's really slow. I'm trying to get at the data and it won't take it. Everybody else is waiting on me, or I've got another thread, right? But I'm tying up some thread, or I'm tying up something to communicate, or somebody's pushing data to me and they're pushing too much. They're not taking enough, or they're pushing too much. It's the classic, distributed system problem. And it just, it's just a very elegant system. You just, you have timeouts and overflows. So you push too much data to me, I just start dropping the data. And you won't take it fast enough, I move on. I drop you. You want to block yourself? That's great. So I got to the point where I realized, well, okay, when this happens, how does somebody know it's happened? And so we started putting sequential message sequences on things that were like broadcast blocks, broadcast transactions, and queries, right? So now okay, I missed something. I'll go back and get it. And so it has incredible, performance characteristics. And under most circumstances, you're not going to see anything drop. These are extreme circumstances. And what we did is we implemented multiple endpoints. We have broadcast endpoints for transactions. So we have 100,000 subscribers on our one endpoint on one machine for transactions, right? New transactions. Just, comes into memory once and we just blast it out to everybody. And same thing for blocks. And then we have a query interface. So this is a bunch of people asking us unique questions. It's more costly on the server to answer these questions, right? And who knows, somebody's attacking you. So you want to open this up to everybody, but you want to deal with, whatever. We don't consider anything malicious. It's just like if we're not handling it right, if we're allowing things to go bad, it's our fault, right? So basically people can kind of do whatever they want, and it works. And the query interface, so what we do when we fire up the server is each one of these endpoints gets its own logical thread, which generally maps to a physical thread, I assume, on the machine. But for the server endpoint, for the query endpoint, and by the way, these endpoints are independent for secured and non-secured. So you can have a non-secured endpoint, or you can have one with cryptCP for any of these. So it's like maybe 8 endpoints, and you can put the whole thing behind Tor or not if you want to. But on the server endpoint, we allow the administrator to configure how many threads they want, and we'll let that go up to the total number of available physical threads, not consumed by the other services. And the whole the node itself can run on, I run on 64 threads, just test it out. I have a 64 core machine I've had for a couple of years. And so the node is highly parallel and has always been asynchronous. So you can run very efficiently on just a single thread. So that, you run 1 to n threads, and we just kind of generally cap it at the physical number. And then the server takes up 1 per endpoint. And then the query service, you can configure as many as you want up to what's available. So you can have a query server that, on a single thread on running on a node, it can handle an ungodly, amount of queries. But you can also scale that out. So the idea of scalability in programming and computer science is you add more hardware, you get better performance. On a linear basis is what that really means, right? That's scalability.
Ideally.
Right. When we talk about scalability, I have one that's called the scalability fallacy in Bitcoin. Bitcoin's not scalable in any way, right? There's a fixed number of transactions that go through it, period, right? That doesn't ever change. And so when we talk about scalability in Bitcoin implementations, what we're talking about is you add more hardware and you get a proportional increase in performance. So if you think about this architecture I just described to you, right, you're not going to improve upon constant time, at least programmatic complexity, right? Big O notation. You're not going to improve on constant time lookup for data. You're not going to improve upon in-memory local, data. Right? And you're going to have as much more memory you have, the more it's going to get used until it's all in memory. And I have like a 256 gig RAM machine here that I used to use to put the whole chain in. It could be there if I was querying it. It would become all memory resident. So it won't all fit there anymore. But I've stepped up again with my Mac Pro. I haven't plugged it in yet, but I can do it. So that's why I got two 64 core machines about 5 years ago, and I still use them. That's what I'm on now for the purpose of scaling out that. So, if you can make the code be able to run in parallel, then as you add more, you get more. Now, there's a limit to that because there's a cost to distribution of the work, right? So you reach an eventual limit, but you don't want the limit to be because you didn't do that, right? That's the limit. So you didn't make it asynchronous and parallelizable. So any function I write in C++ that's a loop, I'm asking myself, does this need to be sequential, right? Can all these 10,000 operations be done in parallel? Okay, great. So I'll use an unordered loop. You have to be careful with that around consensus questions. But that's what we do, is like break it down to what's logically necessary and go, okay, well, all this stuff can be done in parallel. So let's find a way to be doing this in parallel. If you have the RAM, we want to use the RAM. That's why you bought it, right? So let's use all the RAM. We'll be efficient with disk space, but not to the point of hurting performance, right? So chain is about this big in our node as it is in core, I think. It's about comparative, it's about the same. But we don't delete any data. We append. Transaction comes in, we append it to the transaction table. Later it gets confirmed. It's already there. Great. Header comes in, great. And if it gets forked off, we don't care. It's still there. No problem. We're not going to prune it, right? It's very efficient. Things come in, we just append the file, we want to query it, constant time lookup, it's all in RAM, parallel process as much as you can, and then distribute it using the most performant interface you can imagine. So if you're going to write up, all right, so I did this whole digression, but if you're going to write a block explorer, what do you need, right? You need addresses, you need transactions, you need headers, you need heights, at a minimum. So we had all this stuff, and we had this ZMQ interface, but I'm like, wouldn't it be nice if you could just fire up our server and open up a web browser and talk to it? So then you get into dependencies, right? Web code sucks, and it's bad code. You don't want it in your implementation, and the dependencies are big, and I have yet to find good C++, kind of open source, license-friendly stuff I could embed. So this guy who did this work, Neil, he tried a couple things, and I was like, nope, that doesn't pass the smell test, right? First of all, there's a lot of bugs in this code, and second of all, it doesn't satisfy the license. So we went through a couple things. He finds it, fuck it, I'm just going to write it myself. So he wrote a simple HTTP, and then added support for TLS, which does require a third-party library, unfortunately, but put it in there. And then he made a web page, and I said, well, just serialize that web page and put it in a resource in the binary. So basically, you fire up the server, open up your browser, and point to it, and boom, you got a block explorer. He wrote a block explorer. Simple. The web front end is not scalable. It's not designed for that, but it's a simple interface GUI to the thing. It's like a beginning of something new and interesting. But then we realized, okay, well, wait a minute, you got HTTP here. Why don't you do JSON RPC? So we started writing a little JSON RPC interface, and has a subset of the core APIs. So that's all there. It needs a little work, but it works. On the other hand, a company in Canada, who I don't think is doing business anymore, but they were some good engineers. They wrote a web front end for our server, and this was back in like 2017 when mempool was going crazy, prices spiking, whatever. And they already had it done, and they had a little interaction with me, but they did it mostly on their own. And it's called Voyager, I think. Bitcoin block. The source code's still out there. And what they did was they used their own web front end technologies, which according to them were highly scalable and great tech. And then they just used a ZMQ interface from that directly to our server. Right? Probably the only block explorer that's ever been written that actually talks to the node. Right. And so we don't have a mempool. We don't keep transactions in memory. That's ridiculous. Why would you do that? Right. We put them on the disk. The disk is in memory. So, just put them on the disk. So you validated them already. Put them on the disk. They're not confirmed yet. Doesn't matter. Most of them will get confirmed. Not all of them. Right. So anyway, I point that out because during this time period, block explorers were failing. Companies were shutting, exchanges were failing. This was happening on a regular basis because mempools were overflowing with, why is it in memory in the first place, right? Why do you have a C++ object holding this thing in RAM when you could just put it on the disk? So their block explorer was extraordinarily fast and it never hiccuped. It would just scream. It didn't matter. It doesn't matter how big the mempool is. It's constant time lookup against memory on disk. Doesn't matter how much of it there is, right? It makes no consequence whatsoever. How big the chain is, how big the unconfirmed set of transactions, called transaction pool, not the mempool, doesn't matter. And so, it was completely of no consequence. And I thought it was a great validation of some of the work Amir did. I was the one that decided to get rid of the mempool. He had a mempool, and I'm like, we don't need it. We don't need this in memory. So when that happened, it was brilliant because they did it right. And every time somebody says, "Oh, I'm going to make a block explorer on the Bitcoin. I want to know how to query all your transactions into a database," I'm like, "Why the hell would you do that?" Right? Why? You are not going to get a database that's going to retrieve transactions faster than this. It's interesting. There's so many exciting things that can happen from there, but there's still a lot of engineering work to happen.
So you've this conversation has been enlightening for me. I'm definitely going to be using this libbitcoin. But now I want to go back to we're sort of like running a little bit on time. But I want to ask this last question, which is I'm seriously considering writing like a Lightning kind of thing, but specifically targeting Taproot. It would be like I won't even follow the specifications of what Lightning systems are out there. It'll be like greenfield basically. Do you have any advice or guidance on this, or even the very necessity of it?
Of writing
a layer 2, like just be the dentist who pulls the bad tooth.
I'm not. So you're talking about writing a Lightning implementation using?
No. I'm thinking of. I'm preparing to put down some. To actually implement a layer 2. Type technology. It could be like a hash time lock contract, or even this concept called RGB, which was discussed in a previous Indaba I had with Max. And I'd like to hear your opinion on like layer 2. I mean, the main issue really so far that I've got is whether we disconnect from settlement. Is that the main issue, as well as running the node full time?
Yeah, I mean, you're not a layer if you're disconnected, right? You're an altcoin.
Exactly. So you just got to make sure that the settlement happens.
Yeah, that I mean, to me, that's what defines. There's some small comment about this in the book, but that's what the distinction is between layering and altcoins is that your security model is based on settling on the underlying coin. That's what makes it.
Right.
And if your security model is based on settling on an underlying layer, then you're another layer over that, right? But there's been countless proposals for all these things, and I can't even keep up with the work I got to do just to do the engineering work I want to do, stuff that's already shipped in widespread use in Bitcoin. So I don't spend the time to get too deep into any of that, because it's not essential to like the fundamental economic theory. I make some comments here and there on Lightning, but I try not to go too far, because if I haven't implemented it, I don't fully understand it. Everything I talk about in Bitcoin, I've implemented, and I've implemented most of Taproot, and even then, I don't fully understand it, right? But so I'm not the right guy to ask anything about like specifics, except from an economic, kind of security principle standpoint. You are a layer if you need to settle, right? And you're another coin if you don't. And I don't know whether that distinction matters, but
okay.
But my advice would be to, whatever you're going to do, right, write up like a 1-page executive summary of like the core principles and put it out there and get feedback, because I don't know how many things I've seen where, like, after Chia raised $20 million and worked for years, a couple of years at least, I don't know, on a white paper with PhDs and whatever. And I saw the thing, in a tweet when it first came out. I'm like, there's something wrong with this, right? And I read like the summary, and I'm like, oh, well, it's not going to achieve its objectives. I tweeted back like the same day, Bram Cohen on Twitter, and I'm like, dude, you're awesome, but this is it's not a shit coin. It's a proof of work coin. He just didn't realize it. And I pointed out it won't, if you get to the same level of security as Bitcoin, it'll consume the exact same amount of energy. The objective was to do something that was, secure like proof of work, not proof of stake, but didn't consume much energy. I'm like, well, that sounds contradictory. And then when I looked at it, I'm like, they're just gonna manufacture hard drives to the extent that you've consumed as much money in the manufacturing as you're consuming energy, and therefore the manufacturing costs are the manufacturing energy is what's going to consume the same amount of energy. And another year went by, and I think it was Baltic Honey Badger, the first one that I went to, where this had just come out, and I was talking to people about it then. I was pointing it out. It just happened. And then about a year went by, and there was another thing on Twitter, and I was commenting to Bram about it again. I'm like, look, you guys have this issue, and so eventually I think he blocked me. I was like, okay, well, he doesn't want people to hear about this. So about a year after that, I got a message from one of the people that had done a lot of work on it with them. He was part of the team. I don't know, he was a volunteer or what, but he was like a PhD in something or other. And he's like, yeah, we finally realized you were right, and we're pivoting to whatever. It was all proof of work. I'm like, oh yeah, that's been done, So, and now I don't know if it even exists anymore, but would have saved a lot of time if before. I mean, once you've already written the white paper, you've hired the team, and you've got investors, you're committed. It's too late, right? That's the thing I got. Yeah. It's like, yeah, maybe this makes sense, but it's too late. This train has already left the station. So get the ideas out early, and don't worry about competition. That's not the problem. Get them out there and let people give you feedback.
Well, Eric, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for this, and thank you very much for the contribution to the space. It's Herculean.
I like it. It's for me. So
excellent. Okay, so
I appreciate it. Hopefully, get to talk sometime.